I am Eugene, 70 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my own family inflicted. As a man who built his entire life from the ground up, I thought I understood the nature of hard work and sacrifice, but nothing prepared me for the ultimate betrayal living right under my own roof. An old woman had just moved into the empty house next door a few weeks ago. Her name was Sylvia. She kept to herself until this particular evening when the freezing rain began to fall in heavy sheets across the neighborhood. I was standing near the wrought iron fence separating our properties trying to catch my breath when Sylvia suddenly emerged from the shadows. She approached the property line with a stark urgency in her eyes and shoved a heavy manila envelope directly against my chest. I almost dropped it from the sudden impact. She grabbed my wrist with a grip that defied her age and delivered a rigid command. She forbade me from opening the package before exactly 11 o'clock tonight. She strictly warned me against stepping outside my guest annex for any reason, explicitly stating that no matter what noises I might hear outside my window, I must remain hidden. Her voice held a terrifying certainty that sent a deep chill down my spine. Before I could demand a single explanation or hand the envelope back to her, the heavy interaction was shattered by a sharp, piercing yell from the main house. I quickly shoved the envelope under my jacket, concealing it from view as my heart pounded rapidly against my ribs. The tension in the air shifted instantly from the mystery of my new neighbor to the immediate crushing reality of my daily existence. My daughter Valerie stepped onto the grand balcony of the main estate and glared down at me through the pouring rain. She ordered me to put on a high-visibility vest immediately and get to the front gates. Her white husband Bryce was hosting a massive, extravagant launch gala for his newly minted private equity firm. Despite their performative wealth and the catering vans lined up in the driveway, they flatly refused to pay for professional event staff. They expected me to fill the gap. I am a 70-year-old African-American man. I walk with a severe limp due to a surgically repaired knee that constantly aches in the cold dampness. Yet Valerie stood under the shelter of her heated patio and forced me out into the freezing rain to park the luxury vehicles of their wealthy investors. She told me I needed to earn my keep if I expected to continue living on their property. I swallowed the bitter taste of betrayal and limped toward the valet stand without saying a word. The icy rain soaked completely through my thin wool coat within minutes. I took the keys of arriving guests, maneuvering expensive sports cars and heavy sedans into tight spaces across the sprawling lawn. My knee throbbed with a sharp, blinding agony every time I pressed down on a clutch or rushed back to the entrance to greet another arrival. Valerie watched me struggle from the warmth of the foyer, completely unbothered by my physical pain. She treated my labor as a mandatory tax I owed them for the absolute privilege of sleeping in their drafty garden annex. I simply focused on surviving the night, desperately counting down the hours until I could finally examine the contents of Sylvia's mysterious envelope. The intense humiliation of the valet shift escalated rapidly as the night dragged on. I endured hours of physical torment and blatant disrespect from heavily intoxicated guests who refused to acknowledge my humanity. One particularly drunk investor stumbled out of the mansion demanding his car. When I handed him his keys with a steady hand, he scoffed at my soaked clothing and tossed a crumpled $5 bill directly at my face. The money hit my cheek and fluttered into the muddy puddles at my feet. I did not bend down to pick it up. Bryce walked out to the driveway at that exact moment to impress a group of crucial investors. He draped his arm around the man who had just insulted me and pointed a polished finger directly at my chest. Bryce laughed loudly, a cruel and practiced sound that cut through the noise of the rain. He announced to the entire group that I was a completely bankrupt, senile charity case. He told them they only hid me in the annex out of sheer pity because my mind was entirely gone. He then boasted to the laughing crowd that he had successfully finalized the legal paperwork to ship me to a state-run psychiatric ward on Monday morning. He claimed I was a danger to his household, and removing me was an act of profound mercy. The investors nodded sympathetically, praising Bryce for his tremendous burden. My chest tightened into a hard knot. They had not discussed any facility or medical evaluation with me. They were openly broadcasting my forced institutionalization to absolute strangers as a casual joke. The sheer disrespect felt like a physical blow, igniting a quiet, calculating fury deep inside my soul. I absorbed the profound public degradation in absolute silence. I did not yell at my son-in-law. I did not defend my sanity or demand respect from the laughing crowd. I simply turned around, secured the final set of keys on the valet board, and waited until the last guest retreated indoors. Once the driveway finally emptied, I limped across the dark flooded lawn toward my small room in the annex. The freezing rain washed the mud from my boots, but it could not wash away the burning anger solidifying in my mind. I stepped inside my cramped living quarters and shed my soaking wet coat. I locked the heavy deadbolt behind me, ensuring I was completely isolated from the main house. The antique grandfather clock in the corner of my room chimed exactly 11 times, the heavy metallic sounds echoing like a final warning. I sat down at my small wooden desk and turned on the single brass reading lamp. I pulled Sylvia's manila envelope from beneath my jacket. The paper was damp, but the contents inside were perfectly preserved. I remembered her terrifying caution to stay inside no matter what happened next. I took a deep breath, broke the seal, and tore the envelope open. I slid a thick stack of documents and high-resolution photographs onto my desk. I stared at the topmost image and my blood ran entirely cold. The information resting under my hands did not just explain Bryce's sudden cruelty. It set off an irreversible chain of events that instantly destroyed the manufactured reality of my daughter's perfect life. The war had officially arrived at my doorstep, and I was about to launch a devastating counterattack. I spilled the contents of the heavy manila envelope across my small wooden desk. A stack of high-resolution surveillance photographs slid over the scratched surface, accompanied by thick stacks of highly classified corporate bank ledgers. I adjusted my reading glasses and began to sift through the financial documents. The numbers printed on those pages exposed a devastating truth regarding my son-in-law's highly publicized private equity firm. Bryce possessed zero actual capital. The extravagant launch gala happening just yards away from my annex was funded by a completely fraudulent enterprise built entirely on massive illegal leverage. The ledgers detailed a dizzying maze of shell companies, fabricated assets, and forged collateral. Bryce had been funneling illicit loans to cover catastrophic market losses. He was not a brilliant financial mind. He was a desperate criminal, drowning in a sea of toxic debt. I traced my finger over the routing numbers, recognizing the distinct patterns of offshore money laundering. During my decades building Rollins Commercial, from a single concrete mixer into an urban development empire, I had encountered every type of corporate parasite. Bryce was the worst kind. He projected the image of a self-made titan while secretly cannibalizing the resources of dangerous creditors to maintain his facade. The photographs further cemented his ruin. They captured Bryce in shadowy parking garages and dimly lit diners, sweating as he handed thick envelopes of cash to men who clearly did not work in the financial sector. My daughter had tied her life to a man who was moments away from total destruction. The sheer magnitude of his deception made my chest tighten. I flipped to the final page of the dossier, searching for a summary, but instead found a single terrifying directive waiting for me. A small handwritten note from Sylvia rested at the very bottom of the expansive dossier. The heavy ink pressed deeply into the paper, instructing me to look out my driveway window immediately. I pushed the chair back, ignoring the sharp protest of my surgically repaired knee, and crept toward the glass. I carefully pulled back the edge of the heavy curtain and peered into the amber glow of the estate streetlights. The freezing rain was still coming down in thick, relentless sheets, washing over the manicured lawn. A massive flatbed tow truck idled quietly near the very edge of the property line, its diesel engine rumbling with a low, menacing vibration. The truck bore no company logo or identifying markers. The driver stepped out of the cab and stood under the harsh light of the street lamp. He was a heavily muscled man wearing a sleeveless shirt despite the freezing downpour, his thick arms completely covered in dense, intricate syndicate tattoos. These were not the markings of a local repossession agent. They were the undeniable symbols of a highly organized, violent criminal enterprise. He paced the wet asphalt with aggressive impatience, a heavy metal chain swinging idly from his right hand. The flashing orange lights of his truck cast long, distorted shadows across the driveway, illuminating the sheer danger of the situation. Sylvia's warning echoed loudly in my mind. She knew this man was coming. She knew the exact nature of the threat pulling up to my gate. I held my breath and watched the scene unfold, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs as a familiar figure emerged from the side entrance of the main house. Bryce jogged through the freezing rain, holding a leather folder tight against his chest to protect it from the downpour. He approached the intimidating stranger with a nervous, submissive posture that completely contradicted his usual arrogant swagger. I watched in absolute horror as Bryce led the tattooed man toward the detached garage where I stored my most treasured possession. He punched in the security code, and the heavy garage door rolled upward, revealing the pristine midnight blue chassis of my 1968 Pontiac GTO. My late wife, Josephine, and I had spent 5 painstaking years rebuilding that engine piece by piece. It was the very first car I purchased after securing my first major construction contract, a physical symbol of our shared sacrifice and enduring love. Bryce reached into his pocket, pulled out the silver keys, and handed them directly to the syndicate enforcer. He then opened the leather folder and presented the physical title to the vehicle. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. Bryce had broken into my personal safe, forged my signature on the pink slip, and was now using the last tangible memory of my wife to settle a dangerous underground gambling debt. The tattooed man inspected the title, sneered at Bryce, and shoved the documents into his pocket. He signaled to the tow truck, preparing to haul away the single most important object I owned. Bryce stood there shivering, looking pathetically relieved that he had temporarily bought his own survival with my stolen legacy. The utter disrespect for my property and Josephine's memory ignited a fiery rage deep within my soul. Pure, unfiltered adrenaline spiked violently through my chest, urging me to run outside and physically stop the theft of my vehicle. I ignored the agonizing pain in my knee and lunged toward the heavy wooden door of the annex. I grabbed the brass handle, fully prepared to charge into the freezing rain and tear Bryce apart with my bare hands. I twisted the lock, but suddenly Sylvia's terrifying warning flashed across my mind. She had explicitly forbidden me from stepping outside the guest annex tonight, regardless of the noises or the crimes I might witness. She knew the syndicate was armed. She knew that intervening in a cartel collection would result in my immediate execution on the driveway. I gritted my teeth, forcing my primal instincts to yield to cold logic. I released the brass handle and took a deliberate step back into the dark room just as the tow truck engaged its heavy winch. The metal gears ground loudly as they dragged my beautiful Pontiac onto the flatbed. The truck shifted into gear and drove away, carrying Josephine's memory into the night. I exhaled a shaky breath, stepping away from the glass, but the sudden movement caused the heavy curtain to flutter against the window pane. Bryce snapped his head around. His eyes locked directly onto my dark window. He noticed the slight sway of the fabric. The relief on his face instantly vanished, replaced by a dark, murderous rage. He realized I had witnessed the entire illicit transaction. He knew his secret was compromised. Bryce marched directly across the flooded lawn toward my annex, his hands gripping a heavy metal flashlight, shifting the conflict from silent theft to an immediate brutal confrontation. Wyatt did not bother knocking. The heavy wooden door to my annex exploded inward, slamming against the cracked plaster wall with a violent force that rattled the very floorboards beneath my feet. Before my eyes could properly adjust to the sudden intrusion, the blinding high-intensity beam of a heavy metal flashlight struck my face, forcing me to raise my calloused hands defensively against the harsh glare. Wyatt stormed into the cramped room, radiating a frantic, manic energy fueled by sheer panic and a desperate need to cover his criminal tracks. He closed the distance between us in 3 long strides and shoved a rigid clipboard aggressively into my chest, forcing me backward against my wooden desk. He breathed heavily, a potent mixture of expensive bourbon and raw fear clinging to his clothes as he launched into his fabricated narrative. Wyatt shouted that my reckless negligence had cost him tens of thousands of dollars. He claimed that during my humiliating valet shift earlier in the evening, I had taken the keys to my own 1968 Pontiac GTO, lost control of the vehicle in the freezing rain, and reversed it directly into a reinforced concrete retaining wall. He described the imaginary collision with vivid theatrical detail, insisting the chassis was completely shattered and the engine block was entirely beyond repair. I stared at the man screaming at me in the dark, my heart hammering a steady, calculating rhythm against my ribs. I had just witnessed him hand the physical title of that exact car to a heavily tattooed syndicate enforcer not 10 minutes ago. Yet here he stood, weaponizing my advanced age and my physical exhaustion, actively attempting to gaslight me into believing I had destroyed the last tangible memory of my late wife in a fit of elderly confusion. Wyatt slammed a thick ballpoint pen down on the desk next to my trembling hands. He aggressively demanded I immediately sign the attached insurance liability waiver to cover the catastrophic damages I had supposedly caused to the estate property. His voice dropped to a menacing, patronizing whisper as he insisted my memory was severely deteriorating, ruthlessly exploiting my 70 years of age to manipulate my reality. Before I could formulate a response, the annex doorway darkened. My daughter, Valerie, stepped into the freezing room, her damp silk evening gown clinging to her frame. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, her face hardened into a mask of profound disappointment and chilling indifference. She did not question her husband's absurd fabrication for a single second. Instead, Valerie stepped forward and completely supported Wyatt's aggressive narrative. She looked me directly in the eyes and coldly stated that my mind was actively rotting away. She told me I was becoming a severe physical and financial danger to myself and to their pristine household. Without a single shred of empathy, she announced that they had already taken the necessary legal precautions to protect me from my own incompetence. Valerie confirmed they had booked a mandatory involuntary psychiatric evaluation at the notoriously grim Pinecrest facility, and the private medical transport van would arrive to collect me first thing Monday morning. They were no longer simply threatening to institutionalize me as a cruel joke to their wealthy investors. They were actively orchestrating my permanent removal from society, weaponizing the fabricated car crash as the ultimate leverage to lock me in an asylum and throw away the key. I lowered my hands and slowly pulled the clipboard toward me under the harsh, unyielding beam of the flashlight. I adjusted my reading glasses, pretending my vision was severely failing, but my eyes darted rapidly across the dense legal jargon printed on the page. Decades of building Rollins commercial into a massive urban development empire had trained me to read predatory contracts with lethal precision. The document Wyatt shoved into my chest was absolutely not an insurance liability waiver for a damaged vehicle. It was a comprehensive, ironclad medical and financial proxy. The fine print was meticulously designed to strip away my fundamental legal rights, granting Wyatt absolute, irrevocable authority over my healthcare decisions, my private bank accounts, and my vast estate holdings. If executed, this single piece of paper would give a desperate, heavily indebted criminal unchecked access to the wealth I had spent an entire lifetime accumulating. I recognized the immediate, severe physical danger I was in. Wyatt was backed into a deadly corner by a violent criminal syndicate, and Valerie had proven she would sacrifice her own father to maintain her illusion of luxury. If I challenged their lie, if I revealed that I knew the true fate of the Pontiac or the true nature of this deceptive document, Wyatt would not hesitate to use the heavy metal flashlight in his hand to ensure my permanent silence. I swallowed my pride. I let my shoulders slump forward, allowing my hands to shake visibly under the light. I chose to lean entirely into their manufactured narrative, playing the part of a confused, deeply frightened old man whose mind was finally surrendering to the inevitable ravages of time. I looked up at Valerie with wide, pleading eyes, letting a perfectly timed tear well up and spill over my weathered cheek. I whispered a breathless, hollow apology for the imaginary accident, fully embracing the pathetic, broken character they so desperately needed me to be. I reached out with a trembling hand and took the heavy ballpoint pen from the desk. I pressed the tip against the bottom line of the fraudulent proxy document. I did not sign my actual name. Instead, I executed a deliberately altered, legally void signature. It was a highly specific, nuanced forgery technique I had developed decades ago to protect my corporate assets during hostile takeover attempts, ensuring the document would instantly fail any rigorous legal or banking verification process. Wyatt snatched the clipboard from my hands the exact second the pen lifted from the paper. A victorious, deeply arrogant smirk spread across his flushed face. He was completely unaware that he was holding a worthless piece of paper. He had secured what he believed was the master key to my offshore fortune, and his blinding desperation prevented him from noticing my deception. Valerie turned her back on me without a final word, walking out into the freezing rain to return to her lavish party and her wealthy guests. Wyatt followed her out, leaving me alone in the freezing dampness of the room. He pulled the heavy wooden door shut with a violent slam. I heard the sharp metallic click of the heavy exterior deadbolt sliding into place. He had locked my door from the outside, turning my guest annex into a temporary holding cell. I stood in the absolute darkness, trapped inside a new, rapidly escalating crisis, fully armed with the knowledge that their empire was about to burn. The cold gray light of dawn finally broke through the heavy rain clouds, casting long shadows across the flooded estate. I had not slept a single minute. The adrenaline from the night before still pumped through my veins, urging me to act before the situation spiraled completely out of my control. I gathered my coat, stepping out of the freezing annex into the crisp morning air. My immediate objective was clear. I needed to reach my downtown bank and secure my physical assets before the fabricated medical proxy could be filed. I ignored the sharp radiating pain in my surgically repaired knee and marched down the long, winding asphalt driveway toward the main entrance. The towering iron gates stood tall at the edge of the property, usually a symbol of privacy, but today they looked like the bars of a cage. I reached the digital keypad and punched in the standard exit code I had used every single day for the past 4 years. Instead of the familiar mechanical click of the heavy gears turning, the keypad emitted a harsh, buzzing sound. A solid red error light flashed across the small screen. I tried my secondary access pin, but the result was exactly the same. The heavy iron gates were electronically sealed shut. Bryce had deliberately changed the master security passcodes overnight while I was locked in my room. He systematically deactivated my clearance, effectively turning my guest annex and the surrounding grounds into a temporary prison cell. He intended to keep me physically trapped on the estate until the medical transport van arrived on Monday morning to haul me away. He thought he had completely neutralized me, but he severely underestimated the man he was trying to cage. Valerie and Bryce operated under a profoundly arrogant delusion. They genuinely believed I was nothing more than a retired, broken-down bricklayer, surviving entirely on their reluctant generosity and meager social security checks. They thought the faded clothes I wore and the quiet demeanor I maintained were symptoms of a defeated man who had amounted to nothing. They remained blissfully unaware of my actual history. I did not just lay bricks. I founded Rollins Commercial, the largest and most lucrative urban development empire in the entire region. I spent 40 grueling years acquiring commercial real estate, building shopping centers, and securing massive government contracts. When Valerie married Bryce, I saw the blinding greed masking his mediocre talent. I wanted to give my daughter the world, but I refused to let an opportunistic predator drain my life's work. To protect my legacy and test his moral character, I quietly stepped down from public life. I executed a massive legal maneuver, transferring the daily operations and visible assets of my empire into an ironclad blind trust. I deliberately adopted the persona of a destitute old man and asked to live in their guest annex. I wanted to see exactly how they would treat me when they believed I had absolutely nothing to offer them but my presence. For 4 years, I absorbed their relentless insults, their dismissive attitudes, and their cruel jokes, waiting to see if they possessed a single ounce of genuine compassion. Last night, they proved they possessed none. They failed the ultimate test, and now it was time to strip away the unearned luxury they had so comfortably enjoyed. What Bryce failed to realize in his frantic scramble for power was the underlying structure of his entire financial existence. I personally hold the master deeds to the sprawling estate he proudly claims as his own. I also own the anonymous offshore holding company that currently funds his fraudulent private equity firm. Every dollar he spends, every luxury vehicle he leases, and every expensive suit he wears is financed by my capital. To initiate the counterattack, I urgently needed to contact my fiercely loyal corporate attorney, Felix. Felix was the only person fully authorized to execute the defense protocols I had established for this exact scenario. I rushed back to the damp annex to make the call. I picked up the old landline receiver sitting on my desk, but I was met with absolute dead silence. I traced the cord down to the baseboard and discovered the thick wire had been physically severed, cleanly sliced right at the wall jack. Bryce had cut my hardline connection to the outside world. I quickly pulled out my personal cell phone, hoping to rely on the estate's wireless network to send an encrypted email to Felix. My screen displayed no connection. Bryce had maliciously blocked my specific device from the network router. He had orchestrated a complete communication blackout, isolating me from the very resources I needed to dismantle his empire. He wanted me deaf, blind, and mute before the corrupt medical evaluation took place. The sheer calculation behind his cruelty fueled a cold, burning determination within my chest. I refused to be a helpless victim in my own game. I left the annex and began to systematically pace the long perimeter of the property line. I ignored the biting wind and the damp chill seeping through my coat. I searched the towering wrought iron fence for any structural weak point, looking for a loose bar or a gap wide enough to squeeze through. The fence was solid, fortified with reinforced steel and sharp decorative spikes designed to keep intruders out, but currently serving to keep me securely locked inside. I reached the far corner of the estate where the manicured lawn met the dense line of oak trees separating our property from the neighboring house. I gripped the cold metal bars in frustration, mentally calculating how long it would take to break a window in the main house and trigger a physical police response. Before I could finalize that desperate plan, a figure emerged from the dense shadows of the adjacent yard. Sylvia, my mysterious new neighbor, stepped forward into the morning light. She did not look like an ordinary fragile old woman tending to her garden. She moved with a sharp, calculated precision. She walked directly up to the property line and stopped right in front of me. Without speaking a single word, she reached into the deep pocket of her heavy wool coat. She retrieved a small black prepaid burner phone and smoothly slid it through the narrow gap between the metal bars. I caught the device in my palm. I looked at her, understanding immediately that she was not just a bystander in this escalating war. She had just provided me with the exact untraceable tool I desperately needed to launch my devastating counterattack. I snatched the sleek burner phone from Sylvia through the cold iron bars, offering her a single silent nod of profound gratitude. I did not waste a second watching her retreat into the dense morning fog. I immediately dialed the direct, heavily encrypted line of Felix, my fiercely loyal corporate attorney, who managed the intricate layers of my hidden wealth. He answered on the very first ring, his tone sharp and immediately alert to the impending crisis. I did not bother with pleasantries or unnecessary context. I simply ordered him to execute the total liquidation protocol for Bryce's fraudulent equity firm. I instructed Felix to freeze every single cent of the anonymous holding company's operational capital and prepare the catastrophic bankruptcy filings required to completely obliterate my son-in-law's manufactured empire by the end of the business day. I fully expected Felix to confirm the immediate execution of my commands with his usual ruthless corporate efficiency. Instead, a heavy, agonizing silence stretched across the secure cellular line, chilling my blood. Felix finally spoke, and his voice completely lacked its characteristic ironclad certainty. He delivered a piece of terrifying news that slammed into my chest and completely halted my aggressive momentum. We were entirely outmaneuvered on the legal battlefield. Felix grimly informed me that the devastating financial counterattack I just authorized was legally impossible for his firm to execute. The deeply hidden structural foundation of my blind trust had been suddenly and violently compromised while I was locked inside the dark annex overnight. He explained that my specific verbal instructions were currently void because, according to the official state legal registry updated just moments ago, I no longer possessed the necessary cognitive capacity to manage my own vast fortune. Felix rapidly broke down the devastating timeline of the chaotic morning. Bryce had not wasted a single minute after trapping me in the freezing dark. At the exact moment of sunrise, he marched directly into the downtown city court and submitted the forged medical proxy document I had signed under immense duress the night before. Bryce did not file the vital paperwork through standard verifiable legal channels that would thoroughly scrutinize the document. He deliberately bypassed the mandatory waiting periods and administrative background checks by utilizing a notoriously corrupt district judge currently operating on his firm's illicit payroll. With the stroke of a heavily bribed gavel, Bryce successfully filed an aggressive binding emergency injunction. The ruthless legal maneuver was explicitly designed to bypass the protective administrative layers of my blind trust and seize absolute unchecked control of my offshore holding accounts. To legally justify this unprecedented corporate raid, Bryce formally declared me entirely incapacitated and a severe physical danger to myself and others. He weaponized the entirely fabricated story of the crashed Pontiac GTO and my supposed rapid mental deterioration to convince the corrupt court I required immediate involuntary financial receivership. He painted a masterful, terrifying picture of a deeply senile, violently unstable old man blindly squandering a massive generational fortune. The compromised judge happily rubber-stamped the emergency transfer without a single medical hearing, effectively granting my ruthless son-in-law the golden keys to the massive empire I spent 40 grueling years building from concrete and steel. Bryce was no longer just attempting to cover a violent gambling debt to save his own skin. He was executing a flawless, highly orchestrated hostile takeover of my entire existence. The severity of the situation deepened drastically with Felix's next frantic sentence. He stated with grim, absolute clarity that the judicial order was currently sitting in a temporary escrow hold pending final bureaucratic verification at the end of the day. We had an extremely narrow, rapidly closing window of opportunity to reverse the catastrophic damage. Felix explicitly warned me that if I did not physically walk into the downtown courthouse and counterfile my living signature before exactly 5 o'clock this afternoon, the fraudulent proxy would be permanently ratified by the state. If the heavy courthouse doors locked and the clock struck 5, Bryce would instantly gain irrevocable access to $40 million in liquid capital. Once those massive funds transferred into his empty shell accounts, he would immediately wire the money to his dangerous syndicate creditors, erasing the entirety of my fortune forever. I checked the heavy diver's watch tightly strapped to my wrist. I had less than 7 hours to cross the sprawling city, navigate the chaotic traffic, and successfully prove my absolute sanity to a judge. Yet I was physically locked inside a heavily fortified suburban estate with absolutely no vehicle, zero internet access to summon a commercial ride, and zero legal authority to force open the electronically sealed iron gates. Bryce had effectively entombed me within the expansive property lines, calculating that a supposedly frail 70-year-old African-American man with a bad knee could never orchestrate a complex escape without external assistance. He firmly believed he had engineered the perfect, inescapable trap that would secure his stolen wealth. The sheer magnitude of his arrogance forced my sharp mind into massive overdrive. I urgently needed to escape the physical grounds without triggering a violent confrontation that would leave me genuinely injured. I quickly formulated a desperate high-stakes extraction plan utilizing the very technology designed to keep me imprisoned. I ended the secure call with Felix and shoved the prepaid burner phone deep into the hidden lining of my wet coat. I limped aggressively away from the perimeter fence and moved directly into the center of the expansive front lawn, deliberately placing my body in the unobstructed view of the estate's high-definition security cameras. I waited exactly 3 seconds for the red recording light to blink on the nearest sophisticated lens. I suddenly grabbed the center of my chest with both hands, contorting my weathered face into a dramatic mask of pure, unadulterated agony. I collapsed violently onto the wet, freezing grass, gasping loudly for air and clutching my jacket as if my heart were actively failing in real time. I writhed back and forth on the cold ground, staging a severe, terrifying cardiac event designed specifically to force their arrogant hand. The theatrical performance worked instantly. The heavy mahogany front doors of the mansion flew open with a loud crash. Valerie rushed out onto the sprawling porch in a sheer panic, holding her expensive cell phone tightly against her ear. She was completely unwilling to let her father die a messy, highly visible death on her perfectly manicured grass and create an active police crime scene at her pristine home. She yelled frantically at Bryce to stay hidden inside the house. Valerie reluctantly dialed a private medical transport service rather than a standard municipal ambulance, desperate to keep the embarrassing medical emergency entirely off the public police records. I laid quietly in the freezing mud, taking shallow, ragged breaths, knowing I had just successfully summoned my only available getaway vehicle right through their impenetrable iron gates. The heavy tires of the private medical transport van crushed the wet gravel of the driveway just minutes after my staged collapse. 2 paramedics jumped out of the cab, rushing across the flooded lawn with a collapsible stretcher. They loaded my supposedly failing body onto the stiff mattress, strapping thick canvas belts tightly across my chest and thighs. I kept my eyes half closed and my breathing intentionally shallow, maintaining the illusion of a man hovering on the absolute brink of death. Through the pouring rain, I watched my daughter standing under the shelter of the grand porch. Valerie did not ride with me. She did not shed a single tear or offer a word of comfort. She simply crossed her arms over her expensive silk blouse and watched them load me away with an expression of profound, chilling relief. She was entirely convinced she had just permanently removed the final obstacle to her unearned wealth. The paramedics pushed the stretcher into the sterile, brightly lit cargo bay of the transport van. The heavy rear doors slammed shut with a definitive metallic thud, sealing me inside the windowless compartment. The driver climbed into the front seat, secured the electronic locks, and shifted the heavy vehicle into drive. The engine roared to life, and we began the slow, cautious crawl down the winding suburban roads toward the local urgent care clinic. Bryce and Valerie had explicitly chosen a discreet, low-profile facility miles away from the city center to ensure my psychiatric hold remained completely off the public record. They believed they had perfectly orchestrated my quiet disappearance, trusting the slow pace of the medical transport to keep me contained until their corrupt legal proxy became absolute law. The moment the van cleared the heavy iron gates of the estate, I abandoned the pathetic facade. I aggressively unbuckled the thick canvas restraints strapped across my chest and sat straight up on the rigid stretcher. The young paramedic sitting beside me jumped back in sheer terror, completely shocked by my sudden explosive vitality. I reached over and ripped the plastic oxygen monitor directly off my index finger, silencing the rhythmic beeping of the machine. I swung my legs off the mattress and planted my boots firmly on the metal floorboards. I reached deep into the hidden reinforced lining of my left shoe and retrieved a heavy solid gold money clip. It was an emergency asset I carried for decades during volatile real estate acquisitions, an untraceable physical currency that spoke louder than any banking promise. I leaned through the sliding partition window separating the cargo bay from the front cab and tossed the thick block of gold directly onto the center console. The heavy metal hit the plastic with a loud, commanding crack. The driver slammed on the brakes, staring at the small fortune resting inches from his right hand. I leaned closer to his ear and delivered my instructions with absolute, unbreakable authority. I told him to completely abandon the route to the local clinic and drive us straight into the heart of the downtown financial district. I made it explicitly clear that the gold was his to keep permanently provided he bypassed all local speed limits and delivered me to a specific corporate address before the entire commercial banking system closed for the weekend. The driver stared at the gleaming metal on his console, visibly weighing the severe professional risk of abandoning a dispatch medical route against the life-changing wealth sitting right in front of him. The hesitation lasted exactly 4 seconds. He snatched the solid gold money clip, shoved it deep into his uniform pocket, and slammed his heavy boot down on the accelerator. The transport van lurched forward with massive, terrifying speed. The driver violently flipped on the emergency sirens, and the flashing strobe lights transforming our vehicle into an unstoppable force on the wet pavement. We wove aggressively through the dense, rain-soaked city traffic, forcing luxury sedans and commercial delivery trucks to veer sharply out of our frantic path. The heavy chassis of the van leaned precariously around sharp downtown corners, the tires screeching loudly against the flooded asphalt as we closed the physical distance between my temporary prison and my ultimate salvation. I held onto the steel safety rail in the back, checking the heavy diver's watch, strapped to my wrist every single minute. The digital numbers ticked down relentlessly, matching the frantic pounding in my chest. We finally skidded to a violent, smoking halt directly in front of the towering glass lobby of Felix's corporate law firm. I kicked the rear doors open before the vehicle even fully stopped moving. I hit the wet pavement running, leaving the shocked paramedics behind in the idling van. I checked my watch one final time as I sprinted toward the revolving glass doors. I had exactly 40 minutes remaining before the corrupt city judge permanently ratified my son-in-law's fraudulent proxy and erased my entire financial legacy. I sprinted past the stunned security guards in the main lobby, ignoring the burning agony shooting up my surgically repaired knee. I slammed my hand onto the private executive elevator scanner and rode the express car directly to the top floor of the firm. I charged down the marble hallway and burst into the grand mahogany boardroom. Felix was already standing at the head of the massive table, his suit jacket discarded, his eyes locked onto the door. He did not ask a single question about my sudden appearance or my soaked clothing. He immediately dropped a massive, heavy stack of urgent counter-injunctions directly onto the polished wood. I grabbed the premium fountain pen from his outstretched hand and began to sign the documents with frantic, furious precision. Each stroke of my genuine, legally binding signature systematically dismantled the fraudulent proxy Bryce had submitted at dawn. The legal filings instantly established an impenetrable firewall around my offshore holding accounts, legally blocking my son-in-law from accessing a single cent of my capital. The final signature officially triggered an automatic mandatory federal audit of his entire private equity firm, exposing his massive illegal leverage to the federal banking authorities. Felix snatched the final paper from the desk and fed it directly into the encrypted digital court registry. The confirmation screen flashed green, signaling our total legal victory with mere seconds to spare. The ink was barely dry on the mahogany table when a loud, violent crash shattered the professional silence of the floor. The heavy glass doors of the executive boardroom were violently kicked open from the outside, shattering against the metal frames as Bryce himself stormed blindly into the room. The heavy glass doors of the executive boardroom rebounded violently against their metal frames as Bryce stormed into the room. His face was flushed a dark mottled red, radiating a volatile combination of absolute panic and unhinged rage. He did not bother to assess the room or acknowledge the gravity of the legal sanctuary he had just breached. Instead, he marched directly toward the head of the mahogany table, wildly waving his copy of the forged medical proxy in the air like a weapon. He slammed the fraudulent document down onto the polished wood with a deafening crack. His voice broke with manic desperation as he aggressively demanded the immediate unrestricted release of the corporate funds tied to my offshore holding accounts. He screamed that the money legally belonged to him, now citing his emergency injunction, and insisted the capital be wired instantly to cover his bleeding offshore debts. Bryce was hemorrhaging cash, suffocating under the crushing weight of his fabricated equity firm and the highly dangerous syndicate creditors rapidly closing in on his location. He sweat profusely, his expensive designer suit clinging awkwardly to his shaking frame as he barked furious orders at my attorney. He genuinely believed his corrupt morning maneuver at the city court had granted him supreme authority over the massive empire I built. He demanded Felix initiate the multi-million-dollar transfers without a single moment of delay, entirely consumed by the blinding arrogance that had defined his entire adult life. He was a cornered predator, making his final desperate lunge for survival completely oblivious to the ironclad trap that had just clamped firmly shut around his ankles. In his blind, frantic rush for financial salvation, Bryce completely ignored my physical presence in the dimly lit corner of the expansive boardroom. I stood silently near the towering floor-to-ceiling windows, my soaked wool coat dripping freezing rainwater onto the plush carpet, yet I registered as nothing more than a ghost to my arrogant son-in-law. He treated me like a stray dog that had inexplicably wandered into a high-stakes corporate meeting, fundamentally incapable of recognizing the supposedly senile old man who held the absolute power to destroy his entire existence. His bloodshot eyes remained locked fiercely on my corporate attorney, treating Felix as a subordinate administrative employee rather than the lethal architect of his impending doom. Felix remained an impenetrable fortress of ice-cold professionalism. He did not flinch, he did not blink, and he certainly did not cower under Bryce's aggressive, spittle-flecked posturing. Felix simply adjusted his tailored suit jacket, folded his hands neatly over the stack of freshly signed counter-injunctions, and stared back at the desperate man with terrifying clinical detachment. Decades of dismantling hostile corporate takeovers had forged Felix into a ruthless legal weapon, and he watched Bryce unravel with the quiet fascination of a scientist observing a trapped insect. He allowed Bryce to scream himself hoarse, letting the loud echoes of his unhinged demands bounce harmlessly off the soundproof walls. Bryce leaned aggressively over the table, invading Felix's personal space, demanding to know why the digital transfer portals were not already lighting up green. He pointed a shaking, aggressive finger directly at Felix's chest, threatening to have the corrupt district judge strip the firm of its licensing if the offshore accounts were not instantly liquidated into his personal possession. Felix waited patiently for Bryce to completely exhaust his manic tirade before delivering the fatal legal counterblow. With a voice entirely devoid of any emotion, Felix firmly informed Bryce that the requested wire transfers were legally impossible to execute. He calmly explained that there was a mandatory, non-negotiable 24-hour processing hold currently restricting all proxy transfers across the entire corporate network. He stated this massive financial lockdown was initiated automatically due to a sudden, highly irregular federal audit flag that had been triggered on Bryce's private equity firm just moments prior. The sheer shock of the word federal caused Bryce to physically stagger backward away from the table. The color drained momentarily from his face before rushing back in a fiery wave of pure, unfiltered fury. He slammed his fist violently against the heavy mahogany table, sending shockwaves through the quiet room. Bryce issued a direct, visceral physical threat against Felix's life and career, screaming that he would return with armed law enforcement to tear the building apart. Despite his explosive rage, the strict legal timeline offered him a twisted sense of false hope. Bryce falsely believed the 24-hour administrative hold was just a minor bureaucratic hurdle, a temporary delay rather than a permanent death sentence. He convinced himself he had successfully secured the $40 million for the following day, blindly assuming his corrupt judge could effortlessly override the federal audit by morning. He snatched his copy of the forged proxy, spun on his heel, and stormed out of the boardroom, kicking the shattered glass doors out of his way. He rushed back to his vehicle, desperate to assure his dangerous creditors that their money was guaranteed to arrive by sunrise. I stepped out of the dark shadows of the corner, breathing a momentary heavy sigh of relief as the chaotic noise of Bryce's departure faded down the hallway. We had successfully blocked his immediate access to the offshore capital and legally crippled his fraudulent empire, buying us the exact window of time we desperately needed to formulate the next strike. However, the momentary triumph evaporated instantly when I looked at my attorney. Felix did not share my relief. He turned his heavy laptop screen toward me, his face set in a grim, deeply troubling expression. He had been actively monitoring the digital footprints associated with Bryce's mobile device during the hostile confrontation. Felix revealed that Bryce did not just visit the downtown office to aggressively secure the corporate funds. The digital logs exposed a far more sinister and calculated maneuver executed on his frantic drive over to the firm. Bryce had maliciously hacked into the dispatch system of the private medical transport company that brought me into the city. He utilized his administrative authority to officially cancel my return trip, permanently dismissing the paramedics and the van that were supposed to take me safely back to the suburban estate. Furthermore, Felix intercepted a chilling text message Bryce had just sent to Valerie. He explicitly instructed my daughter to lock down the estate security gates and leave me entirely stranded, heavily exposed, and highly vulnerable in the freezing rain-soaked city. Bryce intended for the harsh urban elements to finish the job. He started hoping I would succumb to the severe cold or be picked up by the municipal authorities as a wandering vagrant before the critical 24-hour hold expired. The reality of Bryce deliberately stranding me in the middle of the financial district settled over me as I stepped out of the warm lobby of the law firm and into the unforgiving urban storm. The torrential downpour had intensified, turning the dark downtown streets into overflowing rivers of freezing water. I had no thick winter coat, no personal vehicle, and no time to wait for a municipal taxi to navigate the chaotic weather. I simply pulled my thin, soaked collar tight around my neck and began the grueling 10-block march toward the sleek, glass and steel headquarters of Bryce's manufactured tech startup. Every single step sent a sharp, agonizing spike of pain shooting directly up through my surgically repaired knee, threatening to buckle my legs against the wet pavement. I ignored the screaming protest of my aging joints and forced my body forward through the relentless freezing rain. I was driven entirely by the absolute, urgent necessity to pull his internal corporate server logs before the morning sun broke over the city. I knew Bryce was panicking, frantically scrambling to cover the massive trail of illicit offshore loans and forged collateral that propped up his fraudulent equity firm. If he managed to remotely wipe the primary server farm before I secured the digital ledgers, my counter-injunction would lose its most lethal piece of irrefutable evidence. I had to rip the raw financial data directly from the physical drives tonight. I pushed through the howling wind, keeping my head down and my pace aggressive, refusing to let the bitter cold defeat the burning fury, keeping my blood warm. I reached the towering corporate building with my clothes plastered to my shivering skin, ready to tear my son-in-law's fabricated empire down from the inside out. I completely bypassed the brightly lit, highly monitored main lobby of the corporate tower. I knew the exact layout of the sprawling building from decades of conducting anonymous high-level commercial real estate inspections across the city. I slipped past the decorative hedges and navigated down the steep concrete ramp leading directly into the subterranean rear loading dock. The heavy steel service doors were usually secured by biometric locks after midnight, but I anticipated the lax protocols of a company bleeding cash. I slipped through a slightly ajar side entrance, used by the sanitation crew, and stepped into the dimly lit cavernous receiving bay. I moved quietly past towering stacks of discarded shipping pallets and empty cardboard boxes, heading straight for the service elevators that bypassed the public floors. My wet boots squeaked softly against the polished concrete, masking the sound of my heavy breathing. As I rounded the final concrete pillar near the freight elevator, a massive shadow suddenly detached itself from the gloom. I ran directly into the broad, intimidating chest of the head of overnight security. It was Tyson, a heavily built, muscular young man who took his position with utmost seriousness. Tyson instinctively placed his large hand on the heavy tactical belt strapped to his waist, his eyes widening in pure shock as the overhead fluorescent lights illuminated my soaked, shivering frame. He recognized me instantly from the multiple times I had humbly carried brown paper bags of lunch to Valerie under the guise of a pathetic, subservient errand boy. But the confusion on his face lasted only a fraction of a second before his strict corporate training aggressively kicked in, shifting his posture from surprised recognition to immediate hostile confrontation. Tyson took a dominant step forward and immediately drew the heavy two-way radio from his tactical belt. He pointed a thick finger directly at my chest and commanded me to stay exactly where I was. He bluntly stated that Bryce had personally flagged my profile in the building's security matrix just an hour ago, issuing a strict company-wide directive to arrest me on site for criminal trespassing. Tyson warned me that he was obligated to summon the municipal police and have me hauled away in handcuffs if I took a single step toward the secure elevators. I did not cower, and I did not play the role of the confused, frightened old man I had utilized back at the estate. I straightened my spine, ignoring the freezing ache in my bones, and looked Tyson directly in his eyes with the unyielding authority of a man who had built empires. I delivered a harsh, unfiltered dose of financial reality, cutting right through his misguided corporate loyalty. I informed him that the flashy tech startup he was currently protecting was utterly, irrevocably bankrupt. I told him the venture capital funding had just been completely liquidated by a federal injunction, and his arrogant boss was actively drowning in millions of dollars of illicit offshore debt. I stepped closer to the massive security guard and promised him that his upcoming Friday paycheck was going to bounce so hard it would shatter his own bank account. I laid out the brutal truth that he was currently risking his safety and his reputation to guard an empty shell of a company that would not exist by the time the sun came up on Monday morning. Tyson stared at me in stunned silence as the immense weight of my words collided with his own unspoken suspicions. He lowered the heavy radio, slowly moving his thumb away from the emergency broadcast button. His aggressive, authoritative expression shifted rapidly from strict duty to a dark, sinking realization. He looked down at the concrete floor and bitterly admitted that his last 2 consecutive paychecks had already been flagged by his bank for severely insufficient funds. He confessed that Bryce had fed the entire security staff a string of pathetic corporate lies about temporary accounting glitches and banking holidays to keep them blindly guarding the doors. The anger of a working man realizing he had been exploited by a wealthy fraudster instantly replaced his loyalty to the company. Tyson nodded slowly, making a swift, definitive choice to abandon a sinking ship rather than go down with a cowardly captain. He shoved the 2-way radio deep into his uniform pocket and turned his back on the loading dock exit. He gestured for me to follow him and marched directly toward the fortified security doors guarding the building's digital nerve center. Tyson reached the heavy, reinforced glass doors of the primary server farm and swiped his encrypted master keycard across the biometric scanner. The heavy magnetic locks disengaged with a loud mechanical clack, and he pushed the thick glass open, granting me entirely unrestricted, undetected access to the absolute core of Bryce's fraudulent empire. I stepped into the freezing, brightly lit server room, fully prepared to extract the digital ledgers that would permanently lock the final nails into my son-in-law's financial coffin before he could erase the evidence of his crimes. The freezing air of the server farm bit through my damp clothes, but I ignored the physical discomfort as Javon approached the central administrative terminal. He took a seat at the heavy console, his fingers flying across the backlit keyboard with practiced precision. He utilized his elevated executive-level security credentials to systematically bypass the outer network firewalls that Bryce mistakenly believed were completely impenetrable. We dug directly into the root directories, carefully navigating through complex layers of encrypted folders deliberately disguised as routine maintenance logs. I stood closely over Javon's broad shoulder, my eyes locked intensely on the cascading lines of code and financial data rapidly populating the dual monitors. Decades of managing commercial real estate and tracking massive corporate acquisitions for Rollins Commercial had trained my eyes to spot financial anomalies instantly. We located the master financial ledgers completely isolated from the company's public-facing accounting software. Javon cracked the final security encryption key, and the raw, unfiltered data spilled across the bright screen. We stared at the numbers in absolute silence, the sheer scale of the deception paralyzing the freezing room. Bryce was not operating a legitimate private equity firm that had simply hit a streak of terrible market luck. He was managing a highly sophisticated, deeply illegal financial black hole. The spreadsheets revealed a horrifying reality that extended far beyond simple corporate embezzlement. Bryce had been aggressively shuffling tens of millions of dollars through untraceable shell companies, intentionally bleeding my anonymous holding company dry to mask his alternative revenue streams. He was faking every single investment portfolio, fabricating quarterly returns to appease local investors, while funneling the actual capital into a sprawling, terrifying shadow economy. The numbers painted a very clear, very dangerous picture of a man who had sold his soul to keep his lavish lifestyle afloat. I leaned closer to the glowing monitors, tracing the origin of the massive, unrecorded offshore deposits flooding into Bryce's private operational accounts. He was not simply losing innocent investor capital to bad trades and poor management. He was actively, aggressively laundering massive sums of illicit cash for a highly violent offshore criminal syndicate. The digital routing numbers matched known international cartels organizations that absolutely do not negotiate defaults or forgive missing funds under any circumstances. Bryce had used my legitimate holding company as a clean, respectable front to wash millions of dollars of dirty money desperately skimming off the top to fund the luxury sports cars and the sprawling suburban estate my daughter currently enjoyed. He had literally invited ruthless killers into our family's financial ecosystem, placing Valerie directly in the crosshairs of a deadly international cartel to satisfy his own blinding greed. The sheer, overwhelming danger of the situation gripped my chest like a physical vice. Before I could instruct Javon to copy the critical files, the primary monitors suddenly flashed a brilliant, blinding warning red. The steady, quiet hum of the server farm was instantly shattered as internal system alarms began blaring aggressively throughout the entire glass-enclosed room. Flashing crimson strobe lights illuminated the rows of black server racks, casting harsh, frantic shadows across the polished concrete floor. The command terminal locked up, displaying a massive, blinking notification that an executive override sequence had been triggered from an external mobile device. Bryce had realized his secure network was breached. The system was actively fighting us, attempting to sever our physical connection to the mainframe. Javon slammed his hands on the desk, his eyes darting frantically across the warning prompts multiplying on the screen. The entire digital infrastructure of the company was going into a catastrophic meltdown right in front of our eyes. Bryce had remotely initiated a total catastrophic data wipe directly from his mobile device, frantically scrambling to cover his deadly tracks before the federal authorities could seize the servers. He was aggressively burning his own digital house to the ground to destroy the irrefutable proof of his syndicate ties. Lines of clean code turned into cascading streams of deleted files as the aggressive deletion protocol began eating through the company's financial history. I ordered Javon to salvage the master ledgers before the corruption reached the root directory. Javon ripped a high-capacity external hard drive from his tactical backpack and slammed it directly into the console's primary port. He typed frantically, his fingers moving with desperate blurring speed as he battled against the malicious code rapidly dismantling the network. He forcefully isolated the specific financial folders containing the cartel routing numbers and initiated a manual, high-speed transfer to the physical drive. The system violently fought back, throwing up multiple denial-of-service barriers to terminate the extraction, but Javon aggressively overrode the firewall protocols using his top-tier security clearance. We watched the digital progress bar appear on the screen, a tiny sliver of green fighting against a massive sea of flashing red warnings. The deletion protocol was moving with terrifying speed, wiping out entire databases of client portfolios and employee records in a matter of seconds. We were locked in a frantic, high-stakes digital race against a desperate criminal trying to erase his own execution warrant. Javon gripped the edge of the metal desk, his knuckles turning completely white as he stared at the agonizingly slow transfer rate, praying the hardware would hold out just long enough to secure the evidence. The download progress bar crawled agonizingly to 99%, just as the massive industrial cooling fans above us began to scream violently, protesting the catastrophic system failure tearing through the hardware. The deletion protocol was mere sectors away from the master ledgers, aggressively devouring the final fragments of the company's operating system. The screen stuttered violently, freezing for one terrifying second before a small definitive green checkmark finally flashed across the center monitor. The transfer finished mere milliseconds before the entire server grid went permanently, irreversibly black. The aggressive blaring of the internal alarms cut out instantly, replaced by the eerie, sudden silence of thousands of dead processors spinning down in the freezing room. Javon immediately yanks the physical hard drive from the console and handed it directly to me. I secured the heavy metal drive deep inside the reinforced inner pocket of my soaked wool jacket, zipping it shut to protect the single most important piece of evidence in my possession. We had successfully secured the undeniable proof of Bryce's criminal empire. We barely had a single second to breathe before the heavy, booming sound of fists pounding violently against the exterior loading dock doors shattered the brief silence. The unmistakable, piercing wail of multiple municipal police sirens filled the alleyway outside, their flashing red and blue lights bleeding through the frosted high windows of the receiving bay. Bryce did not just initiate a data wipe to protect his assets. He called the city police, reporting a dangerous, delusional intruder attempting to aggressively destroy his corporate property. He manipulated the municipal authorities, sending heavily armed law enforcement to violently silence me and bury his catastrophic secrets forever in the concrete walls of the downtown precinct. The heavy steel doors of the loading dock blew open with a deafening crash, instantly flooding the receiving bay with the harsh glare of tactical flashlights and the aggressive shouts of municipal police officers. I did not resist or attempt to flee. I raised my hands, slowly projecting total compliance as four heavily armed officers violently slammed me against the cold concrete wall. They aggressively patted me down, roughly confiscating my burner phone, my wallet, and my keys. However, in their frantic rush to secure the supposedly violent intruder Bryce had reported, they completely failed to search the reinforced hidden inner pocket of my soaked wool jacket. The physical hard drive containing the irrefutable evidence of my son-in-law's international money laundering operation remained safely secured against my chest. They shoved me into the back of a freezing patrol cruiser and transported me directly to the downtown precinct. I was stripped of my personal belongings and handcuffed to a bolted metal chair inside a sterile, painfully bright interrogation room. The fluorescent lights hummed with a maddening, mechanical rhythm, illuminating the stark reality of my situation. I sat alone in the chilling silence, staring at the scuffed mirror on the opposite wall, fully bracing my mind for the inevitable arrival of the next phase of Bryce's calculated attack. He had successfully manipulated the local authorities to detain me, buying himself the precious hours he needed to complete his offshore transfers and solidify his fabricated legal guardianship. The heavy door of the interrogation room swung open, but it was not a detective seeking a statement. Valerie burst through the doorway, unleashing a spectacular, meticulously rehearsed performance designed exclusively for the skeptical desk sergeant standing behind her. She did not look at me with concern or anger. She looked at me with profound performative pity. Valerie sobbed hysterically, her designer mascara running perfectly down her cheeks as she collapsed into a plastic chair. She cried loudly to the observing officers, weaving a terrifyingly convincing narrative of my rapid and tragic elderly decline. She claimed my advancing dementia frequently triggered massive, violent, and entirely erratic outbursts, explicitly stating that my presence at the corporate headquarters was the result of a severe, uncontrollable psychotic episode. She painted a picture of a beloved father whose mind had completely deteriorated, leaving him a profound physical danger to society and to himself. The desk sergeant's initial skepticism visibly melted away under the sheer force of her emotional manipulation. He offered her a cup of water and a sympathetic nod, entirely buying into the tragic story of the burdened, suffering daughter. Valerie wiped her eyes with a manicured hand, perfectly executing the final fatal step of their conspiracy right inside the police station. She reached into her designer handbag and retrieved a crisp, formal legal folder, handing the desk sergeant the forged medical and financial proxy Bryce had extorted from me just hours prior. She requested my immediate involuntary transfer to the private paramedics from the Pinecrest facility who were already idling their transport van outside the precinct doors. She insisted the municipal jail was entirely inappropriate for a man requiring acute psychiatric intervention. The sergeant reviewed the document, noted the official court stamp procured by Bryce's corrupt judge, and nodded in absolute agreement. He stepped into the interrogation room, pulled a small metal key from his belt, and unlocked the heavy steel handcuffs binding my wrists to the chair. He gently instructed me to stand up, explaining that my daughter had arranged for my immediate medical transport. I stood slowly, the agonizing reality of the situation crushing the breath from my lungs. Valerie had successfully leveraged the municipal police force to execute my permanent institutionalization. They were preparing to march me directly out the back doors and hand me over to the asylum transport, effectively silencing me forever and completely terminating my counterattack before the federal authorities could intervene. I took a step toward the doorway, bracing myself for the final terrifying ride to the Pinecrest facility. Before the sergeant could place his hand on my shoulder, the heavy door of the interrogation room swung open with explosive force. Sylvia stepped confidently inside the sterile room, completely abandoning her carefully crafted guise as the frail, unassuming old woman who tended the garden next door. She did not wear a faded cardigan or carry a watering can. Sylvia wore a sharp-tailored navy suit and moved with the undeniable aggressive authority of a seasoned federal agent. She bypassed the stunned desk sergeant entirely and flashed a heavy silver badge directly in Valerie's face. She revealed herself not as a neighbor, but as a retired, highly decorated forensic accountant that Felix had privately contracted months ago to silently monitor Bryce's massive financial irregularities. Sylvia forcefully asserted immediate federal jurisdiction over my entire case, stating loudly that my presence at the corporate headquarters was tied to an active, highly classified federal investigation regarding international money laundering. She turned to the desk sergeant, ordering him to halt the medical transfer instantly and release me exclusively into her protective custody. Valerie's fake tears vanished in a millisecond, replaced by a mask of sheer paralyzing terror as the intricate, deadly web of her husband's crimes was suddenly illuminated by the harsh light of federal authority. The trap was broken, and the real war was finally escalating. Sylvia stepped fully into the harsh fluorescent light of the interrogation room, completely shattering the pathetic illusion Valerie had just woven for the municipal police. She did not raise her voice, but her tone carried the absolute crushing weight of federal authority. She bypassed the stunned desk sergeant, entirely flashing a heavy silver credential badge directly in my daughter's tear-stained face. Sylvia revealed herself not as the frail, unassuming gardener from the adjacent property, but as a retired, highly decorated forensic accountant. Felix had privately contracted her months ago to silently monitor the massive financial irregularities bleeding out of my son-in-law's firm. Sylvia forcefully asserted immediate federal jurisdiction over my entire case, stating loudly that my presence at the corporate headquarters was inextricably tied to an active, highly classified federal investigation regarding international money laundering. She ordered the desk sergeant to halt the medical transfer instantly and release me exclusively into her protective custody. Valerie's fake, manipulative tears vanished in a microsecond, replaced by a mask of sheer, paralyzing terror as the intricate, deadly web of her husband's crimes was suddenly illuminated. I stood up, rubbing my wrists where the heavy steel handcuffs had bitten into my skin, and walked right past my daughter without a single backward glance. We exited the precinct, leaving the stunned officers and a panicking Valerie in the lobby. We quickly crossed the rain-slicked avenue and relocated to a secure late-night diner operating in the shadows of the financial district. We slid into an isolated corner booth, safely shielded from the street windows. Sylvia pulled a heavily encrypted laptop from her leather briefcase, and I handed over the physical hard drive I had extracted from the server farm to privately review the decrypted data. The decryption software aggressively chewed through Bryce's hidden firewalls, finally spilling the raw, unfiltered financial ledgers across the glowing laptop screen. The reality of the situation was infinitely more dangerous than a simple case of an arrogant executive committing standard corporate embezzlement. Bryce was not just skimming profits to fund his lavish suburban lifestyle. He was completely submerged in a sprawling, highly lethal international criminal enterprise. The detailed spreadsheets proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Bryce had promised a violently ruthless offshore syndicate a guaranteed $10 million return on their laundered funds. The strict, non-negotiable deadline for this massive capital transfer was exactly 9 o'clock on Monday morning. He had utilized my anonymous holding company as a pristine, respectable shield to wash the cartel's dirty money, operating under the assumption that his fraudulent leverage would indefinitely cover his tracks. His frantic, desperate maneuver to forge the medical proxy and seize my offshore accounts was not merely a greedy power grab. It was a panicked, life-or-death scramble to cover a catastrophic financial shortfall he had recklessly created with unforgiving criminals. The syndicate did not negotiate extensions, and they absolutely did not accept partial payments. If Bryce failed to deliver that specific $10 million wire transfer, when the international markets opened on Monday, the cartel would immediately initiate a violent, systematic collection protocol against his firm and his family. I stared at the cascading columns of illicit transactions, the sheer magnitude of his deception turning the diner coffee cold in my stomach. My daughter had tied her existence to a man who had casually invited ruthless killers into our family's financial ecosystem, placing all of our lives in severe, immediate jeopardy to satisfy his own blinding arrogance. Sylvia pointed a sharp, perfectly manicured fingernail at the primary legal registry attached to the cartel's designated operational accounts. A wave of profound, icy realization washed over me as the deadly catch of our situation became horrifyingly clear. If I instructed Felix to publicly reclaim the holding company right now to legally stop Bryce's theft, I would inadvertently trigger a catastrophic chain reaction. The syndicate strictly and aggressively monitored the state legal registries of the corporations, actively holding their laundered assets. The exact moment their surveillance detected a hostile asset freeze or a sudden unexplained shift in executive control, their standard operating procedure was to immediately execute the registered corporate officers to violently cut their financial losses. Because my blind trust was meticulously structured to maintain absolute public secrecy regarding the daily management, I was still legally listed as the primary corporate officer on all the foundational state and federal documents. Taking immediate, overt legal action to bankrupt my son-in-law would instantly broadcast my true identity directly to a global network of ruthless killers. By attempting to save my vast fortune through traditional judicial channels, I would effectively be signing my own brutal death warrant. We could not simply call the federal authorities and have Bryce arrested for fraud tonight. The sheer exposure of a highly publicized corporate trial would place a massive, inescapable target directly on my back, long before the federal agents could systematically dismantle the cartel network. I was trapped between a desperate, violent son-in-law attempting to lock me in an asylum and an international criminal syndicate that would not hesitate to put a bullet in my chest if they suspected their millions were suddenly frozen by a corporate dispute. Sylvia closed the encrypted laptop and firmly outlined a highly dangerous, razor-thin survival strategy. We had to completely bankrupt Bryce's shell company from the inside out and frame him entirely for the catastrophic financial loss before the Monday morning deadline arrived. By digitally manipulating the internal wire transfers to look like deliberate executive theft, we could force the syndicate to deal directly with his apparent betrayal. This precise maneuver would direct their violent wrath entirely onto him, without ever exposing the existence of my overarching trust or my true identity. To successfully execute this incredibly perilous digital sabotage, I could not hide in the safety of federal protective custody. I had to go back to the hostile estate. I had to walk directly back into the lion's den and play the role of the broken, entirely defeated old man for one final agonizing night. I needed to convince Bryce and Valerie that their cruel precinct trap had successfully shattered my spirit and my cognitive grip on reality. It was the absolute only way to lower their guard long enough for me to physically infiltrate his home network and trigger the financial implosion from his personal verified IP address. I finished the bitter remnants of my coffee, buttoned my damp wool coat, and prepared to embrace the most dangerous performance of my entire life. I stood up from the diner booth, thanking Sylvia for securing the essential data. I stepped back out into the freezing, relentless rain of the city, ready to return to the suburban fortress and orchestrate the total, irreversible destruction of the man who had foolishly tried to bury me. The municipal cab crunched against the wet gravel of the main driveway, halting just inches from the grand stone steps of the estate. I paid the driver with a crumpled bill Sylvia had provided and stepped out into the freezing night air. Wyatt stood waiting under the glowing porch lights, a fresh crystal glass of bourbon in his hand. A sickeningly arrogant smirk stretched across his flushed face as he watched me limp toward him. He falsely assumed my sudden return was a complete surrender, fully believing the freezing city streets and my failing mind had finally broken my spirit. He mockingly applauded my failed escape attempt, loudly declaring that wandering the financial district in a torrential downpour proved exactly why I required permanent institutionalization. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the wet pavement, deliberately projecting an aura of absolute crushing defeat. I allowed my shoulders to slump forward, letting my surgically repaired knee buckle slightly to sell the illusion of total physical and mental exhaustion. Wyatt grabbed me roughly by the damp collar of my coat and dragged me through the heavy mahogany doors into the grand foyer. He did not offer me a towel or a moment to rest. Instead, he shoved a crisp, heavily starched white serving jacket directly into my chest. He aggressively commanded me to put the garment on immediately. Wyatt stated that if I intended to sleep under his roof for one final weekend before my psychiatric commitment, I needed to earn my keep. He treated my return not as a family reunion, but as an absolute submission to his supreme authority. I silently stripped off my soaked wool coat and slipped my tired arms into the tight, humiliating white sleeves, preparing to execute the most dangerous performance of my entire 70 years. I pushed through the swinging wooden doors of the kitchen and entered the massive, brilliantly illuminated main dining hall. Alicia sat rigidly at the far end of the long mahogany table, wearing a completely new diamond-encrusted necklace purchased entirely with my stolen corporate funds. She flashed a tight, meticulously rehearsed smile, desperately attempting to project an aura of effortless wealth. Wyatt stood near the head of the table, nervously adjusting his tailored suit jacket as he entertained three highly intimidating men. Wyatt had proudly announced these men to Alicia as his crucial new venture capital investors, but I recognized their cold, unblinking faces the absolute second I stepped into the room. The encrypted financial ledgers I had ripped from the downtown server farm were permanently burned into my memory. These men were not legitimate tech investors from Silicon Valley. They were the highly violent, ruthless operational fronts for the offshore criminal syndicate. They sat with predatory stillness, their expensive suits failing to mask the brutal, calculating nature of their actual profession. The lead guest, a broad-shouldered man with a jagged scar near his jawline, did not touch his water glass or engage in the superficial small talk. He simply stared directly at Wyatt with the terrifying patience of an executioner waiting for his final payment. Wyatt was visibly sweating under the immense pressure, pouring expensive imported wine with a slightly trembling hand. He was actively hosting the very men who would not hesitate to slaughter his entire household if his fraudulent leverage collapsed. I recognized the sheer immediate danger radiating from the table. My daughter had foolishly invited lethal criminals into her dining room to celebrate a financial empire that was currently built on nothing but forged signatures and dangerous empty promises. I balanced a heavy silver catering platter on my right arm and approached the dining table in absolute submissive silence. The platter held perfectly plated portions of roasted duck and charred root vegetables, the rich aroma completely masking the deadly tension suffocating the room. I deliberately shuffled my feet against the polished marble floor, moving with a sluggish, heavily medicated cadence to maintain the strict illusion of a compliant, deteriorating elder. I approached the lead syndicate enforcer and carefully lowered a porcelain plate in front of him, keeping my hands visibly trembling. I retrieved a bottle of vintage Cabernet and poured the dark red wine into their crystal flutes. A single drop of wine escaped the rim and stained the pristine white tablecloth. Wyatt immediately snapped his fingers at me, his eyes flashing with pure, unadulterated venom, silently warning me not to embarrass him in front of his lethal creditors. I bowed my head submissively and stepped back into the dark shadows near the towering windows. Wyatt quickly recovered his manufactured charm and stood up at the head of the table. He picked up his crystal flute and tapped it lightly with a silver spoon, demanding the undivided attention of the quiet room. He projected a booming, overly confident voice, completely desperate to reassure the dangerous men sitting in his home. Wyatt launched into a highly rehearsed, arrogant speech about expanding global partnerships and securing massive, unprecedented liquidity for their joint ventures. He smiled directly at the scarred enforcer, promising a complete, seamless integration of their newly acquired assets. The criminals stared back at him without a single trace of amusement, waiting strictly for the exact logistical details of their impending $10 million return. Wyatt leaned forward over the mahogany table, completely dropping the corporate jargon to deliver his final desperate guarantee. He looked the lead syndicate enforcer directly in the eyes and promised full unrestricted access to my offshore holding trust by exactly 9 o'clock on Monday morning. Wyatt explicitly boasted that he had successfully executed a flawless medical proxy, legally stripping his senile father-in-law of a $40 million fortune. He confidently assured the ruthless men that the massive capital transfer would hit their untraceable accounts the absolute second the municipal courts opened after the weekend. Wyatt smiled triumphantly, entirely unaware that he had just officially sealed my brutal death warrant. By directly linking my highly classified corporate trust to their illicit laundering operation, he guaranteed that the syndicate would instantly execute me to cut their losses the second I attempted to publicly reclaim my empire. He placed the massive, lethal target squarely onto my chest just to buy himself 48 hours of breathing room. The sheer magnitude of his betrayal solidified my resolve into pure ice. I slowly gathered the empty appetizer plates, maintaining my broken posture, and retreated silently through the swinging wooden doors of the kitchen. The heavy doors closed behind me instantly, cutting off the sounds of Wyatt's arrogant laughter. I dropped the heavy silver tray directly into the stainless steel sink with a sharp metallic crash. I stood entirely upright, shedding the pathetic facade of the defeated old man in a single second. I reached deep into the hidden inner pocket of my damp trousers and pulled out the prepaid burner phone Sylvia had provided. I stared at the blank digital screen, my thumb hovering over the keypad, fully prepared to initiate the catastrophic digital counterstrike that would bury my son-in-law forever. A new neighbor handed me a heavy envelope over the garden fence. She looked me dead in the eye and said I was not to open it until exactly 11 o'clock tonight. She added that no matter what I saw outside my window, I must not leave my house. I thought she was just a paranoid old woman. But when the clock finally struck 11, what I pulled from that envelope made my blood run completely cold, and the flashing amber lights in my driveway proved she was absolutely right. I am Eugene, 70 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my own family inflicted. As an African-American man who built an empire from concrete and steel, I thought I understood ruthless predators, but nothing prepared me for the betrayal living right under my own roof. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My mysterious new neighbor, Sylvia, had just moved into the empty property next door a few weeks ago. She kept entirely to herself until this particular evening when the freezing rain began to fall in heavy punishing sheets across the neighborhood. I was standing near the wrought iron fence separating our properties, trying to catch my breath and ease the ache in my joints when Sylvia suddenly emerged from the deep shadows of her yard. She approached the property line with a stark, terrifying urgency in her eyes and shoved a thick manila envelope directly against my chest. I almost dropped it from the sudden impact. She grabbed my wrist with a grip that completely defied her advanced age and delivered a rigid, uncompromising command. She forbade me from opening the package before exactly 11 o'clock tonight. She strictly warned me against stepping outside my guest annex for any reason, explicitly stating that no matter what chaotic noises I might hear outside my window, I must remain perfectly hidden. Her voice held a chilling certainty that sent a deep primal warning down my spine. Before I could demand a single explanation or hand the heavy envelope back to her, our intense interaction was violently shattered by a sharp, piercing yell coming from the main house. I quickly shoved the envelope under my damp jacket, concealing it from view as my heart pounded rapidly against my ribs. The tension in the cold air shifted instantly from the mystery of my new neighbor to the immediate crushing reality of my daily existence. My daughter Valerie stepped onto the grand balcony of the main estate and glared down at me through the pouring rain. She ordered me to put on a high-visibility vest immediately and get to the front gates. Her white husband Bryce was hosting a massive, extravagant launch gala for his newly minted private equity firm. Despite their performative wealth and the luxury catering vans lined up in the driveway, they flatly refused to pay for professional event staff. They expected me to fill the gap. I am a 70-year-old man who walks with a severe limp due to a surgically repaired knee that constantly aches in the damp cold. Yet Valerie stood under the shelter of her heated patio and forced me out into the freezing rain to park the luxury vehicles of their wealthy investors. She callously told me I needed to earn my keep if I expected to continue living on their property. I swallowed the bitter taste of betrayal and limped toward the valet stand without saying a single word. The icy rain soaked completely through my thin wool coat within minutes. I took the keys of arriving guests, maneuvering expensive sports cars and heavy sedans into tight spaces across the sprawling lawn. My knee throbbed with a sharp, blinding agony every time I pressed down on a stiff clutch pedal or rushed back to the entrance to greet another arrival. Valerie watched me struggle from the warmth of the grand foyer, completely unbothered by my obvious physical pain. She treated my brutal labor as a mandatory tax I owed them for the absolute privilege of sleeping in their drafty garden annex. I simply focused on surviving the night, desperately counting down the hours until I could finally examine the contents of Sylvia's mysterious envelope. The intense humiliation of the valet shift escalated rapidly as the miserable night dragged on. I endured hours of physical torment and blatant disrespect from heavily intoxicated guests who refused to acknowledge my basic humanity. One particularly drunk investor stumbled out of the mansion, aggressively demanding his car. When I handed him his keys with a steady hand, he scoffed at my soaked, shivering clothing and tossed a crumpled $5 bill directly at my face. The money hit my cheek and fluttered into the muddy puddles at my feet. I did not bend down to pick it up. Bryce walked out to the driveway at that exact moment to impress a group of crucial investors. He draped his arm around the man who had just insulted me and pointed a polished finger directly at my chest. Bryce laughed loudly, a cruel and practiced sound that cut right through the noise of the falling rain. He announced to the entire group that I was a completely bankrupt, senile charity case. He told them they only hid me in the annex out of sheer pity because my mind was entirely gone. He then boasted to the laughing crowd that he had successfully finalized the legal paperwork to ship me to a state-run psychiatric ward on Monday morning. He claimed I was a danger to his pristine household and removing me was an act of profound mercy. The investors nodded sympathetically, praising Bryce for handling his tremendous burden. My chest tightened into a hard, suffocating knot. They had not discussed any medical facility or psychological evaluation with me. They were openly broadcasting my forced institutionalization to absolute strangers as a casual, amusing anecdote. The sheer terrifying disrespect felt like a physical blow, igniting a quiet, calculating fury deep inside my soul. I absorbed the profound public degradation in absolute silence. I did not yell at my arrogant son-in-law. I did not defend my sanity or demand basic respect from the laughing crowd of elites. I simply turned around, secured the final set of keys on the wooden valet board, and waited until the long driveway finally emptied. Once the last taillights disappeared down the street, I limped across the dark, flooded lawn toward my small room in the annex. The freezing rain washed the mud from my boots, but it could not wash away the burning anger solidifying in my mind. I stepped inside my cramped living quarters and shed my soaking wet coat. I locked the heavy deadbolt behind me, ensuring I was completely isolated from the main house. The antique grandfather clock in the corner of my room chimed exactly 11 times, the heavy metallic sounds echoing like a final impending warning. I sat down at my small wooden desk and turned on the single brass reading lamp. I pulled Sylvia's manila envelope from beneath my damp jacket. The outer paper was wet, but the contents inside were perfectly preserved. I remembered her terrifying caution to stay inside no matter what happened next. I took a deep breath, broke the wax seal, and tore the envelope open. I slid a thick stack of documents and high-resolution photographs onto my desk. I stared at the topmost image, and my blood ran entirely cold. The information resting under my hands did not just explain Bryce's sudden cruelty. It exposed a massive, fatal vulnerability that set off an irreversible chain of events, instantly destroying the manufactured reality of my daughter's perfect life. The war had officially arrived at my doorstep, and I was fully prepared to launch a devastating counterattack. I pocketed the burner phone, realizing a simple cellular command would not be enough to execute the complex financial sabotage required to dismantle Bryce's empire. I needed direct physical access to his primary workstation. I slipped out the heavy kitchen service door, stepping back into the freezing, rain-swept darkness of the estate grounds. The torrential downpour had finally reduced to a harsh, icy drizzle, but the cold instantly bit through my thin, white serving jacket. I limped around the perimeter of the sprawling mansion, keeping my back pressed tightly against the damp brick until I reached the dense ivy creeping up the side of the house. A thick, reinforced wooden trellis scaled the exterior wall, leading directly to the second-floor balcony attached to Bryce's private home office. I am a 70-year-old man with a surgically repaired knee, and the sheer physical prospect of hauling my body up that slick, rain-soaked wood was daunting. However, the vivid memory of Bryce casually promising my absolute execution to a table of ruthless syndicate enforcers provided an overwhelming surge of pure adrenaline. I gripped the wet wooden slats with my calloused hands and began to climb. Every upward heave sent a blinding spike of agony shooting through my damaged joint, threatening to send me plummeting backward into the mud. I gritted my teeth, forcing my muscles to obey my absolute will. Below me, the raucous booming noise of the dinner party echoed through the floor-to-ceiling dining room windows. Bryce's arrogant, booming laughter and the clinking of crystal glasses perfectly masked the heavy scraping of my boots against the brick facade. I reached the second-story balcony, hauling my exhausted frame over the wrought iron railing. I crept toward the dark office window, finding it slightly unlatched. I slid the glass pane open in absolute silence and slipped like a ghost into the pitch-black room. I stood completely still in the dark, allowing my eyes to adjust to the heavy shadows of the luxurious home office. The faint ambient light from the street lamps outside illuminated the massive mahogany desk dominating the center of the room. Resting squarely in the middle of the leather blotter was Bryce's personal unsecured laptop. He was so blinded by his own arrogance and so deeply engaged in entertaining his lethal guests downstairs that he had carelessly left his primary workstation in standby mode. I moved silently across the plush carpet, ignoring the freezing dampness of my clothes, and flipped the laptop screen open. The monitor flared to life, casting a harsh pale blue glow across my weathered face. The machine required a complex biometric fingerprint scan, but I was fully prepared for his standard security measures. Before I left the downtown server farm, Tyson had provided me with an encrypted USB drive containing top-tier administrative backdoor access codes. I slid the tiny drive into the side port and executed a rapid automated bypass sequence that instantly neutralized the primary firewall. The desktop unlocked, granting me completely unrestricted access to his digital footprint. I did not waste a single second browsing his local files. I immediately launched a highly secure encrypted web browser and navigated directly into Bryce's private offshore banking portal. I utilized the specific routing numbers and Phantom Shell Company credentials I had meticulously memorized from the decrypted server ledgers earlier that evening. I bypassed the secondary authentication layers, pushing deep into the dark financial architecture of his money laundering operation. I stared intently at the glowing screen as the heavily guarded accounts materialized before me, giving me absolute control over the massive sums of illicit cash he was desperately hiding from the federal authorities. I meticulously scanned the sprawling digital ledgers displayed on the screen, cutting through the complex maze of fabricated corporate expenses and fake vendor invoices. Within seconds, I successfully located the primary operational account currently holding the cartel's highly illicit funds. Sitting right at the top of the digital ledger was an initial perfectly clean $2 million deposit the syndicate had placed in his custody earlier that week to initiate the laundering cycle. This was the exact money Bryce was violently desperate to protect, the absolute lifeline he needed to appease the scarred enforcer sitting at his dining table downstairs. Without a single trace of hesitation, I opened the high-priority wire transfer command terminal. I was not going to simply freeze the funds or return them to the authorities. I needed to weaponize the cash to ensure Bryce took the entire fall for the catastrophic loss. I swiftly initiated a massive, irreversible international wire transfer, selecting the entire $2 million balance for immediate relocation. I meticulously inputted a highly specific series of untraceable routing numbers provided to me by Sylvia during our emergency diner meeting. These covert accounts did not belong to my holding company or any federal agency. They belonged directly to a notoriously violent, heavily armed rival criminal organization actively fighting a bloody turf war against Bryce's current investors. I was effectively taking the cartel's money and handing it directly to their absolute worst enemies. I double-checked the intricate routing codes, ensuring the massive digital transaction would completely bypass standard banking delays and execute instantaneously across the encrypted network. I positioned my cursor perfectly over the final authorization prompt, knowing that clicking this single button would permanently detonate the explosive charges planted deep within the foundation of my son-in-law's manufactured life. Before finalizing the catastrophic wire transfer, I executed one final absolutely critical digital maneuver to ensure my complete immunity. I swiftly altered the network metadata and the internal digital signatures attached to the outgoing transaction. I manipulated the system architecture to make it appear exactly as though Bryce had logged in and executed the massive theft personally from his own authenticated IP address and biometric profile. I framed him flawlessly, guaranteeing the syndicate would trace the stolen millions directly back to his personal laptop without ever suspecting external sabotage or my overarching trust. I clicked the final authorization button. A heavy loading bar appeared in the center of the screen, tracking the massive data packet as it forcefully pushed through the offshore banking nodes. The progress bar crawled forward, ticking agonizingly past 50%, then 80%, then 95%. My heart hammered violently against my ribs as I silently willed the digital process to complete. The green bar finally hit 100%, locking the irreversible transfer into the global financial grid. At that exact millisecond, the heavy brass handle of the home office door turned with a sharp, terrifying click. The heavy wooden door swung wide open, hitting the wall with a dull thud. The blinding overhead lights suddenly blazed to life, instantly flooding the dark room with agonizing brightness. I froze completely, the pale glow of the laptop screen still illuminating my damp white serving jacket. Valerie stood frozen in the doorway, her hand still pressing the light switch. Her eyes widened in absolute paralyzing shock as she caught me standing directly over the glowing machine, staring back at her in the sudden glaring light. Valerie unleashed a piercing, frantic scream for her husband, the sharp sound echoing violently down the grand sweeping staircase and instantly disrupting the tense syndicate dinner happening in the formal dining hall below. Her sudden cry shattered the meticulously constructed atmosphere Bryce had spent the entire evening desperately trying to maintain for his dangerous offshore investors. I stood frozen for a microscopic fraction of a second, the harsh blue light of the laptop screen still casting a damning glow across my damp white serving jacket. The irreversible wire transfer of the cartel's $2 million was fully complete, but the digital confirmation page was still highly visible on the monitor. If Valerie or Bryce possessed the presence of mind to step forward and read the screen, my entire sabotage operation would be exposed and my execution would be guaranteed before midnight. I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy, aggressive footsteps abandoning the dining room and charging recklessly up the hardwood stairs. Bryce was rushing toward the office, completely fueled by the sheer panic of a man who knew his fraudulent empire was hanging by a razor-thin thread. I had absolutely no time to safely close the secure browser, wipe the external backdoor drive, or erase my physical fingerprints from the keyboard. I was backed into a highly volatile corner with no physical escape route available. I needed to execute a flawless, immediate psychological diversion to completely redirect their attention away from the computer terminal. I instantly leveraged the exact false narrative they had spent the entire weekend aggressively building against me. I executed the only viable survival tactic available to me, fully embracing the pathetic, broken character they so desperately wanted me to be. I threw my body forcefully onto the plush Persian rug, intentionally allowing my damaged knee to strike the floorboards hard enough to elicit a genuine sharp gasp of physical pain. I scrambled awkwardly into the corner of the office, pressing my back against the expensive wallpaper, and began to rock my torso back and forth with a frantic, erratic rhythm. I forced my eyes to glaze over, stripping away every ounce of the sharp, calculating intellect that had built Rollins Commercial into an urban development titan. I stared blankly at a dark corner of the ceiling and began babbling loudly to my late wife Josephine, completely ignoring Valerie's horrified presence in the doorway. I slurred my words, complaining to the empty air about the rising cost of fresh produce and asking Josephine if she had remembered to bring the canvas grocery bags to the market. I injected a raw, desperate confusion into my voice, portraying a severe, completely disorienting dementia episode designed to mask my true, highly destructive actions. Valerie remained frozen near the light switch, her hands covering her mouth as she watched her father seemingly suffer a total catastrophic cognitive collapse right on her expensive carpet. She did not take a single step toward the desk. She did not glance at the glowing laptop monitor. She was entirely captivated by the tragic, pathetic spectacle unfolding on the floor, fully convinced that the immense stress of the launch gala and the freezing rain had finally snapped my fragile, elderly mind. I kept up the relentless, nonsensical rambling, digging deep into the painful memories of my early years with Josephine, to produce genuine rolling tears that perfectly sold the absolute reality of my fabricated mental decay. Bryce burst through the office doorway like a violent storm, his chest heaving and his face twisted into a mask of unadulterated, panicked rage. He had just abandoned a table full of lethal cartel enforcers, and his eyes wildly scanned the room for whatever catastrophic threat had caused his wife to scream. His frantic gaze swept right past the glowing laptop monitor on the mahogany desk and immediately dropped to my pathetic display in the corner of the room. Confirmation bias is a blinding, deeply arrogant flaw. Bryce had spent the last 48 hours aggressively convincing the municipal police, a corrupt judge, and his own wife that my brain was entirely broken. Now confronted with the vivid physical manifestation of his own malicious lie, he completely ignored the highly sensitive computer terminal that held the evidence of his total financial ruin. He fully believed his own narrative. Bryce marched across the carpet, grabbed the front of my serving jacket, and hauled me upward. He laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that carried zero empathy, highly amused by the tragic state of the man he was systematically robbing. I continued to babble incoherently about grocery lists, refusing to break character, even as he pulled his arm back and kicked me hard in the ribs. The sharp, breathtaking pain radiated through my chest, forcing a genuine groan from my lungs, but I maintained the empty, confused stare of a lost old man. He kicked me a second time for ruining his crucial dinner party, loudly berating me as a useless, senile burden who was completely incapable of understanding basic reality. His sheer arrogance prevented him from realizing he was actively assaulting the very architect of his impending destruction. Bryce grabbed me roughly by the collar of the soaked white serving jacket and violently dragged my body out of the second-floor home office, completely leaving the compromised laptop sitting wide open on the mahogany desk. He hauled me down the narrow back staircase used by the estate's domestic staff, my surgically repaired knee slamming painfully against the hard wooden steps with every aggressive downward pull. He entirely bypassed the warm, insulated interior of the main house, shoving aggressively through the heavy rear service door and throwing me headfirst into the freezing mud outside the guest annex. I landed brutally in the icy, flooded puddles, gasping sharply for air as the freezing rain immediately soaked through my thin clothes. Bryce stood towering over me, panting heavily from the sheer physical exertion, his angry face shielded by the dark, stormy shadows of the night. He pulled a heavy, industrial steel padlock from his jacket pocket and forcefully secured the exterior latch of the annex door, officially trapping me inside the pitch-black, unheated room. He shouted loudly through the thin wooden walls that I would remain locked in this freezing cell without food or water until the psychiatric transport van arrived to haul me away forever on Monday morning. He turned his back and marched confidently toward the glowing windows of the mansion, eagerly returning to his lethal investors to celebrate the massive offshore fortune he falsely believed he had finally secured. I sat alone on the cold, damp floor of the annex, clutching my deeply bruised ribs in the total, suffocating darkness. I was physically battered, freezing and imprisoned, but a fierce, undeniable smile slowly spread across my weathered face. Bryce had absolutely no idea that the digital trap was fully armed, irreversible, and actively counting down. Bryce marched aggressively toward the guest annex, wielding a heavy iron crowbar he had ripped from his pristine garage tool rack. The frantic phone call from his offshore syndicate creditors had completely shattered his arrogant composure, leaving behind a highly volatile, deeply desperate criminal. I watched him approach through the barred window of my small room, fully anticipating his next violent move. He did not bother searching his pockets for the keys to the heavy steel padlock he had used to imprison me the night before. Instead, he raised the heavy iron crowbar high above his head and violently smashed the lock securing my door. The metallic impact echoed sharply across the estate, shattering the heavy mechanism in a single brutal strike. He kicked the wooden door open with terrifying force and charged directly into the small room. He did not speak a single word or demand my compliance. Bryce simply reached forward, grabbed me roughly by the throat of my damp shirt, and hauled my 70-year-old body upward. He dragged me aggressively out of the freezing annex, my boots scraping against the doorframe as he pulled me forcefully across the wet, muddy yard. I did not fight back physically. I allowed my surgically repaired knee to drag through the freezing mud, saving my energy and maintaining the facade of a completely broken, defenseless man. His grip around my neck was suffocating, driven by the sheer blinding panic of a man who realized his execution was guaranteed if he failed to produce $10 million. He needed to physically force my signature onto the physical estate deeds to secure fast cash, and he was willing to break my bones to achieve his goal. As Bryce dragged me relentlessly across the expansive lawn, my eyes locked onto the grand porch of the main house. Valerie stood completely frozen at the top of the stone steps, wrapped tightly in her expensive silk robe. The morning sun illuminated the sheer, unadulterated horror painted across her face. The carefully constructed facade of her perfect elite suburban life had completely evaporated overnight, exposing the violent, desperate reality of the man she had chosen to marry. Bryce was no longer the polished, charismatic equity firm executive she proudly showed off at high society galas. He was a cornered, feral predator, openly willing to physically assault and potentially murder an old man in broad daylight just to save his own skin. I stopped dragging my feet through the mud for one brief, critical second and locked eyes directly with my daughter. This was the absolute final test of her moral character. This was the definitive moment that would cement our relationship for the rest of eternity. I gave her one last undeniable opportunity to intervene. I waited for her to scream for the municipal police to run down those stone steps or to finally step up and save her father from severe physical harm. I stared into her eyes, actively begging the daughter I had raised to break free from her toxic greed and do the right thing before the situation reached a fatal conclusion. Valerie met my intense gaze, but the profound, unbreakable connection of family was entirely absent from her eyes. She witnessed the brutal violence happening right on her front lawn, but she did not run toward me. Instead, she took a deliberate, calculated step backward, retreating deeper into the safe shadows of the grand mahogany doorway. She slowly raised her trembling hands to cover her mouth, actively choosing to silence any potential protest that might draw her husband's dangerous wrath toward herself. In that microscopic, agonizing moment, my daughter made her final choice. She chose the cowardly illusion of her own physical safety over my life, completely abandoning me to the violent desperation of a cornered criminal. The heavy ache of that ultimate betrayal settled deep within my chest, burning away the last remaining shreds of my paternal mercy and instantly hardening my resolve to absolute ice. I stopped waiting for a rescue that I now knew would never come. Bryce jerked my collar, violently breaking our line of sight, and hauled me toward his idling luxury SUV parked in the circular driveway. He shoved me brutally into the leather passenger seat, slamming the heavy reinforced door shut behind me to ensure I could not escape. He sprinted around the front of the vehicle and jumped into the driver's seat. He frantically jammed his finger against the ignition button, bringing the powerful engine to life with a loud, aggressive roar, desperate to reach a corrupt downtown notary and force my signature. Bryce gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. He breathed heavily through his nose, his eyes darting wildly toward the front of the property as he prepared to aggressively shift the heavy vehicle into drive and tear down the long asphalt driveway. He took one final panicked breath, entirely convinced he was just a few forced signatures away from securing the fast cash required to escape the deadly syndicate's retaliation. But before his shaking hand could even pull the gear shifter downward, a deafening explosive crash violently shook the very ground beneath the luxury SUV. The towering reinforced iron gates of the estate, the exact same gates Bryce had electronically sealed the night before to keep me imprisoned, were violently blown entirely off their heavy hinges. A massive cloud of crushed brick and twisted metal erupted into the morning air. Through the settling dust, 3 heavily armored, jet-black tactical vehicles smashed through the ruined entryway with terrifying, unstoppable speed. They roared up the long asphalt driveway in perfect aggressive synchronization, their heavy engines drowning out Bryce's startled scream. The massive federal SUVs skidded to a violent synchronized halt, their heavy tires tearing deep, muddy tracks into the pristine front lawn. They completely blocked the exit route, forming an impenetrable wall of black steel that permanently and flawlessly trapped Bryce's vehicle directly in front of the mansion. The inescapable trap I had meticulously set alongside Felix and Sylvia was finally springing shut. The heavy dust from the demolished iron gates had barely begun to settle across the wet asphalt when the doors of the lead tactical vehicle swung open in perfect military synchronization. Felix and Sylvia stepped out into the crisp morning air, completely flanked by a highly disciplined, heavily armed squad of federal marshals wearing dark tactical body armor. Bryce violently slammed the transmission of his luxury SUV into park, realizing his desperate escape route was entirely severed by the federal blockade. He kicked his driver's side door open and jumped out onto the muddy driveway in a state of blind, unadulterated panic. He frantically reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and retrieved the crumpled, forged medical proxy he had extorted from me just days prior. Bryce waved the fraudulent document wildly in the air above his head, aggressively attempting to establish his absolute legal authority over the chaotic situation. He genuinely believed the corrupt paperwork that had temporarily granted him power in the municipal courts would somehow act as an impenetrable shield against federal law enforcement. The marshals immediately fanned out across the manicured lawn, forming a tight, inescapable perimeter around the vehicle, their hands resting securely on their holstered weapons. Bryce stood completely surrounded, his chest heaving with terrified, ragged breaths as he desperately tried to project the commanding aura of a wealthy corporate executive. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Felix, demanding the federal agents step aside and respect his court-ordered mandate. He remained entirely oblivious to the lethal reality closing in around him, clinging to a worthless piece of paper, while the true architects of his total destruction calmly approached his trapped vehicle. Bryce aggressively closed the distance between himself and the advancing line of federal marshals, screaming at the top of his lungs that his fundamental civil rights were being egregiously violated by their sudden intrusion. He pointed violently toward my captive position inside the passenger seat of the luxury SUV, shouting to the heavily armed agents that I was a legally insane, completely incompetent old man who presented a severe immediate danger to society. He adamantly declared that he possessed the absolute court-mandated right to transport me directly to a secure psychiatric facility for my own protection and medical supervision. His voice cracked with a pathetic, desperate pitch as he begged the marshals to review the official signature on his medical proxy, utterly convinced that his manipulated judicial order would force them to stand down and clear the path. Felix did not argue with the frantic, cornered criminal. He stepped forward with cold, deliberate precision, his pristine, tailored suit a sharp contrast to the tactical gear surrounding him. He smoothly pulled a slim digital tablet from his leather briefcase and maximized the volume on the internal speakers. Felix tapped the screen once, and the crystal-clear audio recording of Bryce's own arrogant voice echoed across the sprawling suburban estate. The recording explicitly captured Bryce plotting to forcefully drug me in the dark annex to secure the fraudulent signature on the proxy documents. The playback exposed his cruel, calculated intentions to illegally strip away my vast offshore fortune and permanently lock me in an asylum. Bryce froze entirely, his mouth falling open in sheer horror as he heard his own malicious, undeniable confession broadcasted directly to the federal authorities, completely destroying his fabricated narrative of being a concerned, burdened son-in-law acting out of familial mercy. Sylvia stepped smoothly past the paralyzed, speechless figure of my son-in-law, entirely dismissing his pathetic presence on the driveway as if he were nothing more than an irrelevant obstacle. She walked directly up to the lead federal marshal and handed him a secure, highly encrypted digital portfolio containing the irrefutable evidence we had extracted from the downtown server farm. She methodically walked the high-ranking agent through the highly classified corporate bank ledgers, displaying the undeniable concrete proof of Bryce's massive internal embezzlement and his sophisticated, highly illegal money laundering operations. She highlighted the specific catastrophic transaction I had executed from his home office laptop just hours prior, displaying the massive wire transfer of $2 million routed directly from his personal operational account into the untraceable hands of a highly violent rival criminal syndicate. The meticulously documented evidence laid bare the absolute totality of his vast financial crimes, proving he was not a legitimate equity firm executive, but a desperate cornered thief actively stealing from ruthless international cartels. The damning digital proof completely annihilated Bryce's entire legal defense in a matter of mere seconds, rendering his forged medical proxy utterly worthless in the face of massive federal fraud and conspiracy charges. The last remnants of his manufactured arrogance evaporated entirely into the cold morning air. Bryce stood completely speechless and trembling violently on the muddy driveway, his eyes darting frantically, looking for a non-existent escape route. He finally realized the immense crushing weight of the trap I had patiently set for him, understanding that his desperate grab for my hidden fortune had just systematically dismantled his entire life and guaranteed his permanent imprisonment. The lead marshal reviewed the final pages of the digital portfolio, nodded sharply to Sylvia, and took a highly intimidating dominant step directly toward my trembling son-in-law. He looked Bryce dead in the eye and delivered a piece of devastating information that entirely crushed whatever tiny sliver of hope the desperate man still clung to. The marshal firmly informed Bryce that the very syndicate members he had spent the entire weekend desperately trying to appease had officially given up his exact suburban location in a sweeping federal plea deal early this morning. To save their own lives from a massive international sting operation, the ruthless cartel fronts had completely surrendered his identity and his specific financial coordinates to the federal government, leaving him entirely exposed to absorb the total legal fallout of the massive laundering conspiracy. Bryce let out a pathetic, suffocated gasp as the absolute reality of his complete and total destruction finally set in. He had betrayed his family, robbed his legitimate investors, and alienated his highly dangerous criminal partners, leaving himself entirely isolated without a single ally on the entire planet. The heavily armed marshals did not grant him a single moment to protest his innocence or negotiate his inevitable surrender. Two massive federal agents lunged forward, grabbed Bryce roughly by his tailored shoulders, and slammed him aggressively against the cold metal hood of his own luxury SUV. They forced his arms behind his back, placing him in heavy steel handcuffs that clicked shut with a loud, incredibly satisfying finality. The lead marshal formally read Bryce his Miranda rights, his authoritative voice ringing out clearly across the ruined estate, officially ending the arrogant reign of terror and securing my absolute undeniable victory. Two federal marshals grabbed Bryce by the shoulders of his ruined designer jacket and shoved him aggressively into the reinforced back seat of the primary tactical vehicle. The heavy ballistic-rated door slammed shut with a definitive metallic boom, instantly cutting off his frantic, suffocated screams for a lawyer. The immediate physical threat to my life evaporated into the cold morning air, leaving only the rhythmic flashing of red and blue emergency lights reflecting across the muddy asphalt of the circular driveway. I remained seated inside Bryce's luxury SUV for a brief moment, allowing my racing heart to finally steady itself after the violent extraction attempt. Through the rain-streaked windshield, I watched the heavy oak doors of the mansion swing open. Valerie bolted out onto the grand stone porch, her expensive silk robe completely soaked by the relentless drizzle. She did not run toward the federal vehicles to defend her husband, or demand an explanation from the heavily armed agents swarming her property. She possessed a highly calculated parasitic survival instinct. She instantly recognized that Bryce was an entirely sunken ship, completely destroyed by his own catastrophic arrogance and international financial crimes. Valerie immediately pivoted her strategy, shifting seamlessly from a complicit co-conspirator to a terrified, helpless hostage. She scrambled down the concrete steps, her bare feet slipping slightly on the wet stone, and threw herself directly into the center of the chaotic scene. She locked eyes with the lead federal marshal and unleashed a spectacular theatrical wail of pure agony, desperately attempting to manipulate the gathered authorities with a perfectly orchestrated display of feminine vulnerability. Valerie collapsed dramatically to her knees on the sharp, wet gravel of the driveway, completely disregarding the mud ruining her pristine silk robe. She buried her face in her manicured hands and sobbed hysterically, shouting to the towering federal agents that Bryce had violently forced her into every single act of elder abuse. She swore on her life that she lived in absolute terror of his explosive temper, insisting she knew absolutely nothing about the stolen offshore millions or the lethal international cartel money laundering operation. She painted herself as a tragic, battered wife who was systematically coerced into signing the fraudulent medical proxy against her own beloved father. I pushed the heavy passenger door of the luxury SUV open and stepped slowly onto the slick pavement. A sharp, blinding spike of agony shot through my surgically repaired knee, and my bruised ribs protested fiercely against the cold dampness. But I refused to show a single ounce of physical weakness. I stood entirely upright, methodically brushing the wet dirt and crushed gravel off the sleeves of my ruined jacket. I walked with slow, deliberate, and commanding steps toward the center of the driveway, forcing the armed marshals to part and make way for the true owner of the estate. I stopped mere inches from where my daughter kneeled in the mud. I looked down at the woman I had spent my entire life working to protect the daughter I had fiercely shielded from the harsh realities of the world. She had willingly chosen blinding greed over her own family, actively trading my dignity and my freedom for a false sense of elite suburban supremacy. Her fake tears pooled on the asphalt, but they evoked absolutely zero sympathy from my hardened soul. Sylvia stepped away from the lead tactical command vehicle, her sharp navy suit cutting an authoritative figure through the morning fog. She walked directly to my side and extended her hand, presenting me with a small, highly sophisticated digital audio player. During the chaotic raid on the corporate headquarters the previous night, Felix had not only secured the financial ledgers, but had also successfully subpoenaed the cloud storage accounts linked to the estate's internal smart home surveillance system. I took the cold metal device from Sylvia's hand, my thumb resting heavily over the primary playback button. I did not raise my voice to argue with Valerie's pathetic manufactured lies. I simply pressed the button, maximizing the digital volume. The quiet, tense atmosphere of the front yard was instantly shattered by the crystal-clear, high-definition playback of Valerie's own arrogant voice. The recording had been captured just last week in her pristine dining room. The audio filled the damp air, broadcasting a conversation where she laughed cruelly and continuously with Bryce about the sheer convenience of locking me permanently inside the Pinecrest Psychiatric Asylum. Her recorded voice echoed across the driveway, excitedly detailing exactly how she planned to immediately liquidate my life insurance policies the second I was legally declared incompetent. She gushed with sickening enthusiasm about using my death benefits to fund an extravagant month-long luxury vacation to Paris, completely dismissing my existence as nothing more than a highly profitable inconvenience. The heavily armed federal marshals stood in absolute stony silence, listening to the undeniable, horrific depths of her premeditated betrayal. The sheer malice captured in the audio file dismantled her carefully constructed victim narrative with surgical, devastating precision. Valerie froze entirely, her body going completely rigid on the wet gravel. The hysterical, fabricated tears stopped flowing the absolute microsecond she heard her own malicious laughter broadcasted directly to the federal authorities. The color violently drained from her face, leaving her completely pale and utterly speechless as the inescapable reality of her situation crashed down upon her. She slowly lowered her hands from her face, staring up at me with wide, terrified eyes, finally understanding that her lifelong manipulation tactics had completely run out of power. She could not gaslight a federal audio recording, and she could no longer hide behind her husband's shattered empire. I looked down at the woman I had raised, feeling a profound, heavy emptiness where my unconditional paternal love used to reside. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my jacket and retrieved a crisp, formal legal folder prepared by Felix at dawn. I dropped the heavy document directly into her trembling lap. I informed her with a voice devoid of any warmth or mercy that the paper was a formal, legally binding eviction notice authorized by the overarching corporate trust that owned the entire estate. I stated with absolute, unyielding authority that she had exactly 1 hour to enter the mansion, pack her personal clothing, and permanently vacate my property. I made it explicitly clear that every piece of furniture, every piece of jewelry, and every luxury vehicle was legally seized as corporate collateral to cover the massive debts her husband had incurred. I promised her that if she was still standing on my land when the 60-minute deadline expired, the federal marshals would physically drag her out to the street. Valerie unleashed a piercing, frantic scream for her husband, the sharp sound echoing violently down the grand, sweeping staircase and instantly disrupting the tense syndicate dinner happening in the formal dining hall below. Her sudden cry shattered the meticulously constructed atmosphere Bryce had spent the entire evening desperately trying to maintain for his dangerous offshore investors. I stood frozen for a microscopic fraction of a second, the harsh blue light of the laptop screen still casting a damning glow across my damp white serving jacket. The irreversible wire transfer of the cartel's $2 million was fully complete, but the digital confirmation page was still highly visible on the monitor. If Valerie or Bryce possessed the presence of mind to step forward and read the screen, my entire sabotage operation would be exposed and my execution would be guaranteed before midnight. I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy, aggressive footsteps abandoning the dining room and charging recklessly up the hardwood stairs. Bryce was rushing toward the office, completely fueled by the sheer panic of a man who knew his fraudulent empire was hanging by a razor-thin thread. I had absolutely no time to safely close the secure browser, wipe the external backdoor drive, or erase my physical fingerprints from the keyboard. I was backed into a highly volatile corner with no physical escape route available. I needed to execute a flawless, immediate psychological diversion to completely redirect their attention away from the computer terminal. I instantly leveraged the exact false narrative they had spent the entire weekend aggressively building against me. I executed the only viable survival tactic available to me, fully embracing the pathetic, broken character they so desperately wanted me to be. I threw my body forcefully onto the plush Persian rug, intentionally allowing my damaged knee to strike the floorboards hard enough to elicit a genuine, sharp gasp of physical pain. I scrambled awkwardly into the corner of the office, pressing my back against the expensive wallpaper, and began to rock my torso back and forth with a frantic, erratic rhythm. I forced my eyes to glaze over, stripping away every ounce of the sharp, calculating intellect that had built Rollins Commercial into an urban development titan. I stared blankly at a dark corner of the ceiling and began babbling loudly to my late wife Josephine, completely ignoring Valerie's horrified presence in the doorway. I slurred my words, complaining to the empty air about the rising cost of fresh produce and asking Josephine if she had remembered to bring the canvas grocery bags to the market. I injected a raw, desperate confusion into my voice, portraying a severe, completely disorienting dementia episode designed to mask my true, highly destructive actions. Valerie remained frozen near the light switch, her hands covering her mouth as she watched her father seemingly suffer a total catastrophic cognitive collapse right on her expensive carpet. She did not take a single step toward the desk. She did not glance at the glowing laptop monitor. She was entirely captivated by the tragic, pathetic spectacle unfolding on the floor, fully convinced that the immense stress of the launch gala and the freezing rain had finally snapped my fragile, elderly mind. I kept up the relentless, nonsensical rambling, digging deep into the painful memories of my early years with Josephine to produce genuine rolling tears that perfectly sold the absolute reality of my fabricated mental decay. Bryce burst through the office doorway like a violent storm, his chest heaving and his face twisted into a mask of unadulterated, panicked rage. He had just abandoned a table full of lethal cartel enforcers, and his eyes wildly scanned the room for whatever catastrophic threat had caused his wife to scream. His frantic gaze swept right past the glowing laptop monitor on the mahogany desk and immediately dropped to my pathetic display in the corner of the room. Confirmation bias is a blinding, deeply arrogant flaw. Bryce had spent the last 48 hours aggressively convincing the municipal police, a corrupt judge, and his own wife that my brain was entirely broken. Now, confronted with the vivid physical manifestation of his own malicious lie, he completely ignored the highly sensitive computer terminal that held the evidence of his total financial ruin. He fully believed his own narrative. Bryce marched across the carpet, grabbed the front of my serving jacket, and hauled me upward. He laughed a cruel, mocking sound that carried zero empathy, highly amused by the tragic state of the man he was systematically robbing. I continued to babble incoherently about grocery lists, refusing to break character even as he pulled his arm back and kicked me hard in the ribs. The sharp, breathtaking pain radiated through my chest, forcing a genuine groan from my lungs, but I maintained the empty, confused stare of a lost old man. He kicked me a second time for ruining his crucial dinner party, loudly berating me as a useless, senile burden who was completely incapable of understanding basic reality. His sheer arrogance prevented him from realizing he was actively assaulting the very architect of his impending destruction. Bryce grabbed me roughly by the collar of the soaked white serving jacket and violently dragged my body out of the second-floor home office, completely leaving the compromised laptop sitting wide open on the mahogany desk. He hauled me down the narrow back staircase used by the estate's domestic staff, my surgically repaired knee slamming painfully against the hard wooden steps with every aggressive downward pull. He entirely bypassed the warm, insulated interior of the main house, shoving aggressively through the heavy rear service door and throwing me headfirst into the freezing mud outside the guest annex. I landed brutally in the icy, flooded puddles, gasping sharply for air as the freezing rain immediately soaked through my thin clothes. Bryce stood towering over me, panting heavily from the sheer physical exertion, his angry face shielded by the dark, stormy shadows of the night. He pulled a heavy, industrial steel padlock from his jacket pocket and forcefully secured the exterior latch of the annex door, officially trapping me inside the pitch-black, unheated room. He shouted loudly through the thin wooden walls that I would remain locked in this freezing cell without food or water until the psychiatric transport van arrived to haul me away forever on Monday morning. He turned his back and marched confidently toward the glowing windows of the mansion, eagerly returning to his lethal investors to celebrate the massive offshore fortune he falsely believed he had finally secured. I sat alone on the cold, damp floor of the annex, clutching my deeply bruised ribs in the total, suffocating darkness. I was physically battered, freezing, and imprisoned, but a fierce, undeniable smile slowly spread across my weathered face. Bryce had absolutely no idea that the digital trap was fully armed, irreversible, and actively counting down. I walked slowly through the massive, echoing halls of the main estate, the heavy silence amplifying the sound of my boots against the bare floors. The sprawling mansion, once suffocated by imported Italian leather sofas, crystal chandeliers, and ridiculous statues of unearned opulence, now sat completely empty. The moving crews had flawlessly executed their orders, stripping the house down to its very studs and removing every single trace of the toxic luxury Bryce and Valerie had hoarded. Without the blinding distraction of their stolen wealth, the true architecture of the home finally breathed again. I retrieved a simple mop and a bucket of warm, soapy water from the utility closet. I took quiet, profound pride in physically cleaning the thick, dried mud off the imported marble foyer myself. This was the exact spot where Valerie had so cruelly ordered me out into the freezing rain just days prior, treating me as a disposable piece of machinery. With every deliberate stroke of the mop, I scrubbed away the remnants of their profound arrogance and the bitter memories of my silent subjugation. My surgically repaired knee ached with a dull, persistent throb, but the physical labor felt incredibly restorative. I was not cleaning up after a spoiled child or an abusive son-in-law. I was actively reclaiming my own territory, washing away the stain of their parasitic greed. The sprawling house was no longer a monument to a fraudulent equity firm or a hollow marriage built on deceit. It was a completely clean slate, stripped down to its bare, honest foundation, standing ready to host a new, honorable chapter of my life. I wrung out the mop, watching the murky water swirl down the drain, feeling the immense satisfaction of a man who had successfully purged the absolute poison from his personal sanctuary. The next morning, I dressed in a pristine, tailored suit that perfectly fit the founder of Rollins Commercial and commanded a town car to the downtown financial district. I bypassed the loading docks and walked directly through the towering glass doors of the main corporate headquarters, officially reclaiming my rightful position at the absolute head of the executive boardroom. The building was already buzzing with a nervous electric energy following the devastating federal raid on Bryce's fraudulent operations. I immediately convened an emergency meeting with Felix and the remaining legitimate board members to untangle the financial wreckage. We systematically severed all remaining ties to the offshore syndicates and isolated the few clean, profitable logistics contracts that Bryce had arrogantly ignored. I called Tyson, the overnight security guard who had risked his own freedom to grant me access to the vital server farm, directly into the executive suite. I looked the stunned young man in the eye and officially transferred the startup's remaining untainted assets and major shipping routes entirely into his custody. I appointed Tyson as the new operational director, placing him in charge of rebuilding a legitimate functioning freight firm completely from scratch. He possessed the gritty, unbreakable work ethic and the raw, uncorrupted moral compass that my son-in-law had so spectacularly lacked. I wanted to actively invest in a man who understood the profound value of an honest dollar earned through grueling labor, rather than a predator who viewed wealth as a weapon of domination. Tyson accepted the massive responsibility with a firm, deeply grateful handshake, cementing a new era of integrity for the logistics empire I had built. I watched him walk out of the boardroom with his shoulders squared, knowing I had just secured the long-term future of the company by entrusting it to someone who genuinely respected the monumental weight of the opportunity. I returned to the quiet, heavily fortified suburban estate later that afternoon, feeling the immense weight of the corporate battle finally lifting from my tired shoulders. I walked over to the wrought iron property line and formally invited Sylvia over to the main house for a simple cup of black coffee. She arrived shortly after shedding her sharp federal suits for a comfortable woven sweater, completely leaving behind the intense forensic investigator persona that had saved my life. I carried 2 plain, unadorned wooden chairs out onto the grand stone porch, deliberately replacing the gaudy, overpriced lounge seating Bryce had previously destroyed in his panic. We sat side by side in the crisp, cooling afternoon air, wrapping our hands around the warm ceramic mugs. We looked out together over the vast, entirely empty circular driveway where the violent, explosive chaos of the previous days had finally concluded. The deep, muddy tire tracks left behind by the heavy federal tactical vehicles were the only remaining physical scars of the brutal extraction. The deafening sirens, the desperate screams of my treacherous daughter, and the aggressive posturing of the federal marshals were now nothing more than a fading echo. Sylvia and I did not need to exchange a flood of words or recount the terrifying details of the cartel sabotage. We simply shared the comfortable, unspoken camaraderie of 2 seasoned professionals who had successfully navigated a deadly labyrinth and emerged entirely victorious. The crisp autumn wind rustled the heavy oak trees lining the perimeter fence, carrying away the last lingering remnants of the suffocating tension that had gripped my property for 4 agonizing years. I offered her a slight appreciative nod, silently acknowledging the immense physical and legal risks she had boldly taken to help an old man bring a massive criminal conspiracy crashing down to the earth. As I stared out across the manicured lawn, I allowed myself to genuinely mourn the total, devastating loss of my only daughter to the absolute corruption of unearned wealth. I felt a heavy, agonizing ache settle deep within my chest, mourning the innocent little girl Josephine and I had raised long before blinding greed had infected her soul. Valerie had willingly traded her own flesh and blood for the hollow illusion of elite suburban supremacy, and the sheer tragedy of her irreversible choice would forever remain a scar on my heart. However, despite the profound paternal grief, I sat proudly in my wooden chair, knowing I had successfully executed the most critical defense of my entire existence. I had completely reclaimed my hard-earned peace, my unyielding personal dignity, and the massive commercial empire I built with my own 2 hands. I refused to let my twilight years be dictated by a parasitic son-in-law or a cowardly daughter who viewed my advanced age as a fatal weakness. They had stripped me of my car, my communications, and my freedom, fully expecting me to quietly surrender to a psychiatric ward. Instead, I systematically dismantled their entire universe and orchestrated their total financial ruin using nothing but patience and raw intellect. I took a slow, deep sip of the bitter black coffee, letting the absolute stillness of the sprawling estate wash over my weathered bones. The silence surrounding my home was no longer a heavy, oppressive burden of submission. It was the beautiful, undeniable sound of absolute freedom. I closed my eyes and listened to the gentle sway of the ancient oak branches finally breathing easily in a fortress that entirely belonged to me, fully prepared to embrace whatever peaceful, triumphant chapters remained in my long, hard-fought life. True power does not roar. It observes in silence and strikes with calculated precision. The ultimate tragedy of toxic greed is that it blinds predators to the quiet strength of their perceived victims. Family should always be a safe sanctuary built on mutual respect and unwavering loyalty, not a transactional battlefield where love is weaponized for financial gain. We must actively learn to set absolute boundaries, recognizing that sometimes cutting ties is the highest form of ultimate protection. Dignity is never negotiable, and age never diminishes our capacity to fight back. Reclaiming your peace is indeed the most beautiful victory. Have you ever had to draw a hard line to protect your peace from toxic family members? Share your experience in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of justice, boundaries, and unyielding resilience.